The piano in the corner of the red lantern hammered out a tune that sounded like it had been dragged through the mud, missing keys and sharp notes clattering against the low timber ceiling. It was a Saturday night in the late 1880s, and the air inside the saloon was thick enough to chew. It smelled of stale beer, unwashed bodies, cheap tobacco, and the acrid tang of coal oil burning in the lamps that swung precariously from the rafters. Eliza moved through the haze like a ghost haunting her own life. She carried a tray laden with amber whiskey bottles and shot glasses that looked as if they had never been truly clean. Her feet ached with a deep, throbbing rhythm that seemed to echo the beat of the piano, shooting sharp pains up her calves and settling into the small of her back. She wore a dress of faded crimson silk, the lace at the cuffs fraying, the neckline cut lower than she would have ever chosen for herself. It was a costume, a uniform for a war she was losing every single day. She set the tray down on a table where 4 men were playing poker, their faces obscured by the shadows of their hats. One of them reached out and brushed his hand against her hip, a casual, claiming gesture that made her skin crawl. Eliza did not flinch. She had learned long ago that flinching only made it a game for them. Instead, she forced the corners of her mouth up into a shape that resembled a smile, though it did not reach her eyes. Her eyes were green, the color of river moss, and tonight they were dull with a fatigue that sleep could not cure. She was 22 years old, but she felt 100. As she turned back toward the bar, the noise of the room faded into a dull roar, and for a moment, she was not in the red lantern. She was back in the cramped, freezing interior of a covered wagon 3 years ago. She could smell the sickness that had clung to her brother, Thomas. She could hear the rattle of his breathing, the sound of a life slipping away because they did not have the money for a doctor or the medicine the apothecary in this very town had promised would save him. Eliza remembered the desperation that had driven her to Mr. Briggs, the owner of the saloon. She remembered begging for the loan, the $20 that would buy the elixir. She remembered Briggs's smile, oily and paternal, as he told her she could work it off. Thomas had died 2 days later, the medicine useless against the fever that had already consumed him. But the debt remained. The $20 had somehow become $50 with interest, and then $100 with room and board. The ledger Briggs kept in his office was a shackle heavier than any iron chain. A shout from the bar snapped her back to the present. More whiskey. Girl, and look alive about it, the barkeep bellowed, slamming a dirty rag onto the counter. Eliza lowered her head and hurried to obey, the phantom memory of her brother's cold hand slipping from hers replaced by the cold reality of the bottle she gripped. She was hungry. It was a gnawing, physical sensation in her belly, for she had not eaten since morning. But the hunger went deeper than that. She starved for silence. She starved for a door she could lock. She starved for dignity. Near the front of the saloon, the bat-wing doors swung open, letting in a gust of wind that carried the scent of snow and sagebrush. A man stepped inside, shaking the dust from a heavy canvas duster. He looked different from the town drunks and the loud-mouthed gamblers. He moved with a deliberate slowness, favoring his left leg. This was Caleb. He was a cowboy in his early 30s, though the sun and wind had etched lines around his eyes that made him look older. He had just come in off the northern trail, driving a herd of stubborn longhorns up from the basin, and his bones felt like they were grinding against each other. His boss had sent him into town to secure supplies and have a drink, telling him to relax. Caleb did not know how to relax. He walked to the far end of the bar, finding a space where the shadows were deepest. He ordered a whiskey and nursed it, holding the glass in a hand that was calloused and scarred from years of rope burns and barbed wire. He did not turn his back to the room. He leaned against the polished wood, his hat pulled low, watching the room with eyes that missed nothing. There was a scar that ran from his lower rib cage around to his back, a souvenir from a range war in Texas that he tried hard to forget. It pulled tight when the weather turned cold, and tonight it was burning. He shifted his weight off his bad leg, the one a horse had crushed 5 years ago, and scanned the crowd. Violence had a smell. Caleb knew it well. It smelled like copper and sweat. and it hung heavy in the red lantern tonight. His gaze landed on the woman in the red dress. He watched Eliza weave through the tables. He noticed things other men ignored. He saw the way she held her left arm stiffly against her side, protecting a bruise he could not see but knew was there. He saw the way she swallowed hard before answering a man who spoke to her, bracing herself for whatever filth came out of his mouth. He saw the bruises on her wrist, partially hidden by the lace of her sleeve. Dark fingerprints left by someone who had grabbed her too hard. She looked like a bird trapped in a chimney, beating its wings against the soot, slowly suffocating. Caleb took a sip of the burning liquor and looked away, telling himself it was none of his business. He was just passing through. He had his own ghosts to outrun. But then the noise at the center table spiked. A burly ranch hand, a man Caleb recognized as a troublemaker from a rival outfit, reached out and grabbed Eliza by the waist. He was drunk, his face flushed and sweating, his eyes glassy with liquor and malice. "Come here, darlin'," the man slurred, yanking her down. "Sit on my lap and bring me some luck." Eliza stumbled, the tray in her hand tilting dangerously. "Please," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "I have work to do. Sir, please let go." The man laughed. "A wet, ugly sound. Your work is whatever I say it is. You ain't nothing but a saloon girl. You don't tell me no?" He pulled harder, and Eliza lost her footing, falling against his heavy thigh. She scrambled to right herself, her hands pushing against his chest. "I said, let go!" The rejection turned the man's lust into fury in a heartbeat. He stood up, knocking his chair back, and his hand lashed out. The sound of the slap cracked through the saloon like a gunshot. Eliza cried out, stumbling back against a pillar. Her hand flew to her cheek, which was already turning a violent shade of red. The room went silent. The piano player stopped mid-chord. The ranch hand loomed over her, his chest heaving. "Don't you ever talk back to me, you worthless little whore. You're lucky I even look at you." Eliza pressed herself against the wood of the pillar, her eyes wide with terror. She waited for the next blow, curling inward to protect her ribs. It did not come. Caleb had moved without thinking. One moment he was leaning against the bar. The next, he was standing between Eliza and the ranch hand. He did not have his gun drawn, but his hand hovered near the worn walnut grip of the Colt on his hip. He stood with a stillness that was more terrifying than any shouting. "That is enough," Caleb said. His voice was not loud. It was a low rumble, calm and edged with steel. It was the voice of a man who had looked death in the face and found it boring. The ranch hand blinked, trying to focus on the intruder. "Who the hell are you? Get out of my way. Cripple! This is between me and the girl. She asked you to stop," Caleb said, his eyes locking onto the other man's. "You hit her. Now you are going to walk away," the ranch hand scoffed, looking around at his friends for support. Two other men at the table stood up, their hands drifting toward their belts. "You going to make me? You and what army?" Caleb did not flinch. He did not look at the other men. He kept his focus entirely on the aggressor. "I'm giving you a choice. Walk out that door, or we see who is faster. I do not care which one you pick." The air in the saloon seemed to vibrate. Caleb felt the old familiar coldness spread through his chest, the shutting down of fear, the sharpening of his senses. He knew exactly where everyone was. He knew he could drop the ranch hand before the man cleared leather. He also knew the other two would likely kill him before he could turn. It was a bad play, a stupid play. But the sound of that slap was still ringing in his ears, echoing a helplessness he thought he had buried years ago. Suddenly, a booming voice broke the tension. "Gentlemen, gentlemen, Mr." Briggs emerged from his office at the back of the room, wiping his hands on a silk handkerchief. He was a portly man with eyes like polished stones and a mustache he waxed daily. He stepped into the circle of tension, smiling a smile that promised nothing good. "Let us not have any bloodshed tonight," Briggs said smoothly, stepping between Caleb and the ranch hand. "It is bad for business. The floor is freshly swept." He turned to the ranch hand. "My apologies, sir. The girl can be temperamental. She forgets her place." Then he turned to Caleb. his eyes narrowing slightly. "And you, stranger? I appreciate the chivalry, but my customers are here to enjoy themselves. There is no need for guns." Caleb did not relax his stance. He hit her. "She provoked him," Briggs said, his voice dropping an octave, losing its joviality. "And she is my property until her debt is cleared. Do not interfere with my property, Cowboy, unless you have $500 to buy her contract right now." Caleb's jaw tightened. He had $40 in his pocket, his pay for 3 months on the trail. He looked at Briggs, seeing the utter lack of humanity in the man's face. He looked at the 3 armed men facing him. Briggs smiled again, tight and dismissive. "Sit down. Friend, have a drink on the house. And you, Eliza, apologize to the gentleman for upsetting him." Eliza lowered her hand from her cheek. Her face burned, but the shame burned hotter. She looked at Caleb. She saw the tension in his shoulders, the way his hand was still poised to draw. She saw a man willing to die for a stranger. She could not let that happen. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I was clumsy. I did not mean to cause trouble." The ranch hand sneered. "See that you remember it next time." Briggs clapped his hands. "There, settled. Back to your games, boys." Caleb stood there for a long moment. He felt the weight of the room against him. He felt the bitter taste of bile in his throat. He wanted to burn the place down, but if he drew now, he would be dead in 3 seconds, and Eliza would still be trapped. He slowly let his hand drop from his waist. He stepped back, his eyes still hard on the ranch hand. "You are a lucky man," Caleb said softly. He turned to look at Eliza. She was shrinking back into the shadows, clutching her tray against her chest like a shield. Her eyes met his, and the expression in them stopped his heart. There was gratitude there, vast and overwhelming, but behind it was a bottomless despair. Her lips moved, forming a silent plea. "Don't! Please don't die for me!" Caleb nodded once, a sharp, stiff motion. He turned and walked out the bat-wing doors, the laughter of the saloon erupting behind him like a taunt. That night, Eliza lay on the thin, lumpy mattress in the attic room she shared with 2 other girls. The room was freezing, the wind whistling through the cracks in the clapboard walls. Her cheek throbbed where she had been struck, but she barely felt it. She was thinking of the cowboy, Caleb. She had heard the barkeep say his name. She closed her eyes and saw his face again. It was not a handsome face. It was too rough, too weathered, but it was the first face in 3 years that had looked at her without seeing a commodity. He had looked at her with anger. Yes, but the anger had been for her, not at her. A new kind of hunger woke in her belly. It was a sharp, tearing need. It wasn't for bread or beef. It wasn't even for sleep. It was a hunger to be seen, to be a person, to have value that wasn't measured in drinks served or nights sold. The memory of his hand hovering over his gun, the steel in his voice when he told the man to stop. It was a warmth she cupped close to her heart, terrifying and precious. The door to the attic creaked open. Eliza stiffened, feigning sleep. It was Mr. Briggs. He held a lantern, the light casting long, distorted shadows against the sloped ceiling. "Eliza," he said. She sat up slowly, clutching the thin wool blanket to her chin. "Yes, Mr. Briggs?" He stood in the doorway, blocking the exit. "You caused a scene tonight. I don't like scenes." "I apologized," she said, her voice steady despite her fear. "You did," he acknowledged, "but I have been thinking. You are getting older. Eliza, you are not as fresh as you used to be, and you are becoming difficult." Eliza said nothing. "I have a business associate," Briggs continued, examining his fingernails. "Up in the Granite Peak mining camp. He needs women, tough women. The miners up there are demanding. They pay well for compliance." Eliza's blood turned to ice. Granite Peak was notorious. It was a hellhole cut into the side of a mountain, a place where law did not exist and women were used up and discarded like empty bottles. If the Red Lantern was a prison, Granite Peak was a death sentence. "I have sold your contract to him," Briggs said casually. as if discussing the price of cattle. "You leave in 2 days. The stage will take you as far as the pass, and his men will collect you there." "No," Eliza whispered. "Please, I have been paying. I have been working." "You have been paying interest," Briggs sneered. "The principal remains. And now, I have made a profit on you. Pack your things. Eliza, you are going to the mines whether you like it or not." He turned and left, taking the light with him, slamming the door shut. The darkness that rushed back into the room felt heavy, like earth being shoveled onto a coffin. Eliza sat in the dark, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The mines. She would not survive a month there. She would die in the dark, used and broken, and no one would even know where to bury her. She looked at the small, frosted window. Outside, the wind howled. A resolve hardened in her chest, brittle and sharp as glass. She would not go. She would rather freeze to death on the open plains. She would rather be torn apart by wolves. At least the wolves would only kill her once. The following evening, the sky turned the color of a bruised plum. The air grew heavy and still, the kind of pressure that built before a serious storm. Caleb stood by the cattle pens on the edge of town, checking the hooves of his gelding. The horse was a sturdy bay, reliable and calm, much like Caleb himself. The drive was over. His boss had paid him off that morning. He should have been moving on, heading south to find winter work in a warmer territory. But he hadn't left. He couldn't get the image of the green-eyed girl out of his head. He tightened the cinch on his saddle, his movements automatic. 2 men were leaning against the fence nearby, smoking rolled cigarettes and laughing. Caleb recognized them as hired guns who worked odd jobs for the local businesses. "Did you hear?" one man said, spitting a flake of tobacco. "Briggs is shipping that one with the green eyes up to Granite Peak." The other man chuckled. "The quiet one? God help her. That camp eats people alive. She won't last a week." "Good riddance," the first man said. "She was too haughty for a whore anyway. Maybe the miners will teach her some manners before they break her." They laughed again. A cruel, scraping sound. Caleb stood frozen, his hand gripping the leather strap of his saddle. The cruelty of it twisted in his chest like a knife. Granite Peak. He knew of it. It was a place where men went to disappear and women went to die. He looked up at the sky. Thick slate-gray clouds were rolling in from the north, swallowing the tops of the distant mountains. The temperature was dropping fast. A winter storm was coming. A bad one. He should ride away. He should get on his horse and ride south, away from the storm, away from the town, away from the girl who wasn't his problem. He had spent years learning to mind his own business, learning that intervening only brought pain. But as he swung into the saddle, he didn't turn south. He turned his horse toward the livery stable, his mind racing. Night fell like a hammer. The wind picked up, whipping dust and grit through the streets, stinging any exposed skin. The first flakes of snow began to swirl in the air, fat and heavy. In the back room of the Red Lantern, Eliza was moving fast. She wore every piece of clothing she owned, 2 shifts, a wool dress, and a threadbare gray coat that was far too thin for a Wyoming winter. She had stolen a loaf of stale bread from the kitchen and wrapped it in a handkerchief. She reached under the loose floorboard beneath her bed and pulled out a small tin box. Inside were $12, money she had skimmed, coin by coin, over 3 years. It wasn't enough to buy her freedom, but it might be enough to buy a seat on a wagon heading east, if she could make it to the next town. She shoved the money into her boot. She tied a scarf around her head. She opened the window. The cold hit her instantly, shocking and brutal. It smelled of ice and distance. Eliza climbed out onto the narrow roof of the lean-to shed below, her boots slipping on the frost-slicked shingles. She lowered herself down, hanging by her fingertips before dropping into the alleyway. She landed hard, jarring her knees, but she didn't stop. She ran. She stuck to the shadows, avoiding the main street where the saloon lights cast yellow pools on the snow. The wind pushed against her, trying to drive her back, but she lowered her head and fought through it. She headed north, away from the road, toward the open prairie. She knew there was a homestead about 10 miles out. If she could get there, maybe they would let her sleep in the barn. It was a desperate, foolish hope. But it was all she had. Inside the saloon. 20 minutes later, Briggs kicked open the door to Eliza's room. It was empty. The window was open. Snow drifting onto the floorboards. "Damn it!" he roared, his face turning purple. He spun around and marched down the stairs. "Stark! Miller! Get in here!" The two men Caleb had seen by the fence hurried over. "The girl is gone." Briggs spat. "She went out the window. She can't have got far. Get your horses. It is blowing up a storm out there." "Mr. Briggs," Stark said, looking at the windows rattling in their frames. "I don't care if it is raining fire," Briggs shouted. "She owes me $500 or the price of the contract. Go get her. Bring her back breathing. I don't care if she is happy. I don't care if she is hurt. Just bring her back so I can ship her out." The men nodded, seeing the promise of a bonus in Briggs's eyes. They grabbed their rifles and headed for the door. Caleb was at the livery stable, just finishing bedding down his horse for the night. He had told himself he was staying because of the storm. He had told himself it was suicide to ride in this weather. He heard the saloon door bang open down the street. He heard the shouting. He heard the sound of galloping hooves as two riders tore out of town, heading north into the dark. Caleb stood in the doorway of the stable, the lantern in his hand swaying in the wind. He knew. He didn't need to ask. He knew exactly what was happening. Eliza had run, and the wolves were chasing her. He looked at the warm pile of straw where he was supposed to sleep. He looked at his horse, tired but strong. If he stayed, he would be warm. He would be safe. He would wake up tomorrow, drink coffee, and ride south. He would live a long, quiet life. If he went, he was riding into a blizzard. He was riding against two armed men. He was riding for a woman who was nothing to him, just a pair of sad green eyes and a bruise on a wrist. Caleb cursed softly, a low, bitter sound in his throat. He blew out the lantern and walked back to his horse. "Sorry, boy," he murmured, stroking the animal's neck. "We are not done yet." He threw the saddle back onto the horse, his movements precise and fast. He checked his Winchester rifle in the scabbard. He checked the Colt at his hip. He pulled his hat down low and tied his scarf tight around his face. He mounted up and rode out of the stable. The wind hit him like a physical blow, screaming in his ears. The snow was falling harder now, a white curtain dropping over the world. Caleb spurred his horse, heading north, following the fading tracks of the two men who were hunting the girl. He rode into the dark, into the cold, into the danger he had spent 5 years avoiding. He rode because he couldn't forget the way she had looked at him. He rode because if he didn't, he would never be able to look at himself in a mirror again. The town faded behind him, swallowed by the storm, and Caleb was alone in the night, a hunter hunting the hunters, driven by a conscience he thought he had killed long ago. The wind did not just blow, it hunted. It tore across the open plains of Wyoming with a shriek that sounded like a dying animal, driving needles of ice through the thin wool of Eliza's coat. The world, which only hours ago had been a vast expanse of sagebrush and rolling hills, had vanished. In its place was a suffocating curtain of white, a swirling void that erased the sky and the ground until there was no up or down, only the biting cold. Eliza stumbled, her foot catching on a hidden root beneath the snow. She fell hard, her hands plunging into the drift, the ice searing her skin like fire. She gasped, sucking in air that tasted of iron and frost, and scrambled back to her feet. She could not stop. Stopping meant dying. Her boots, cheap leather with soles worn thin from years of pacing saloon floors, were already soaked through. Her toes were numb, distant blocks of wood attached to her feet. The cold had moved past pain and settled into a dull, heavy ache that radiated up her legs, making every step a battle against her own body. She pressed on, head down, shielding her face with a scarf that was stiff with frozen breath. In the howling dark, a face swam up in her memory. Thomas, her brother. She saw him not as he had been at the end, wasted and feverish in the back of the wagon, but as he was when they were children, sitting on a fence rail in Missouri, swinging his legs. "Promise me, Liz," he had whispered when the sickness took his voice. Promise me you won't stay trapped. Promise me you will find a life that is yours. I am trying. Thomas, she thought, the words screaming in her mind to drown out the wind. I am trying. She had walked for what felt like hours, though it might have been only minutes. The landscape was deceptive in a blizzard. A stand of cottonwoods she thought was close turned out to be a mile away. Or perhaps they were just shadows conjured by her exhaustion. The snow was deepening, dragging at her skirts, weighing her down. She was a small thing against the enormity of the winter, a speck of gray in a world of white violence. Then, over the roar of the wind, she heard it. It was a sound that did not belong to the storm. The rhythmic, heavy crunch of hooves breaking through crust, the jingle of a bit chain. Eliza froze, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She looked back, squinting through the stinging sleet. Two dark shapes were emerging from the gloom, spectral and terrifying. Riders. They were hunched low in their saddles, hats pulled down, but she knew them. She knew the shape of their shoulders, the way they sat their horses. Briggs had sent his dogs. Fear, sharp and electric, spiked through her frozen limbs. She forced her legs to move, breaking into a clumsy, lurching run. She headed for a cluster of granite boulders jutting out of the snow like broken teeth, hoping to squeeze into a crevice, to become invisible. Her breath came in ragged tears. She was 20 yards from the rocks. 10 yards. A shout cut through the air. There she is! The crack of a pistol shot shattered the night. The bullet did not hit her, but it struck a rock just to her left, sending a spray of stone chips and snow into her face. It was not a kill shot. It was a hurting shot. It was the sound of a master cracking a whip. Eliza cried out, stumbling, her legs finally giving out. She collapsed into the snow at the base of the rocks, curling into a ball, shaking so hard her teeth rattled. She pressed her hands over her ears, waiting for the grab, for the rough hands that would drag her back to hell. But the grab did not come. Instead, a second horse thundered in from the east, moving with a speed that defied the treacherous ground. Caleb had ridden hard, cutting through a dry wash he knew from the autumn drive, flanking the two men before they even knew he was there. He knew this land better than he knew his own soul. He knew where the drifts piled deep and where the wind scoured the ground hard enough for a horse to find footing. He burst out of the white haze like an avenging spirit, his bay gelding snorting steam. He pulled the horse up short, putting himself directly between Eliza and the two riders. His Winchester rifle was already shouldered, the dark metal cold against his cheek. "Hold it right there!" Caleb roared. His voice carried a weight that the wind could not scatter. It was the voice of a trail boss, a man used to turning stampedes. The two riders, Stark and Miller, yanked on their reins, their horses rearing in confusion. They had expected a terrified girl, not a man with a rifle leveled at their chests. "Who is that?" Stark shouted, squinting against the snow. "Move on! Stark!" Caleb called back. His tone dropped, becoming flat and deadly. "Turn those horses around and ride back to town. It is the cripple," Miller sneered, though his hand hovered uncertainly near his holster. He knew Caleb's reputation. He knew about the scar. "Get out of the way. Cowboy, that girl is Briggs's property. We have orders. And I have a Winchester," Caleb said. The lever action clicked loudly as he cocked it, a mechanical sound that promised a sudden end. "You want to die out here in the freeze for $50? Is that what your life is worth? She belongs to Briggs." Stark yelled, frustration warring with self-preservation. "She owes me money," Caleb lied smoothly. The words tasted like ash, but he knew these men. They did not understand mercy, but they understood greed. "She picked my pocket before she ran. I am claiming what is mine. You tell Briggs he can take it up with me when the snow clears." The two men hesitated. The wind howled around them, a banshee scream that promised death to anyone foolish enough to linger. They looked at Caleb, sitting steady as a rock, the rifle barrel not wavering an inch. Then they looked at the huddled lump of gray coats in the snow behind him. "To hell with this," Miller muttered. "I am not freezing to death for a skirt. Let him have her. Briggs will skin him alive later anyway." Stark spat on the ground. "You are a dead man. Cowboy. You know that? Caleb did not answer. He just kept the rifle aimed at the center of Stark's chest, with a final curse. The two men wrestled their horses around and kicked them into a gallop, disappearing back into the storm as quickly as they had come. Caleb held his position for a long minute, waiting until the sound of their hoofbeats was swallowed by the wind. Only then did he lower the rifle and slide it back into the scabbard. He dismounted, his bad leg protesting the sudden drop, and limped over to the rocks. "Eliza," he said. She did not move. She was a heap of snow-covered wool, motionless. Caleb knelt beside her, brushing the snow from her shoulders. He turned her over gently. Her face was pale as milk, her lips a shocking shade of blue. Her eyes were half open, glazed and unseeing. She was mumbling, words tumbling out in a slur of delirium. "No, not the attic. Please, I paid. Eliza," Caleb said, his voice rough with worry. He pulled off his gloves and pressed his hands to her cheeks. She was ice cold. The hypothermia was setting in deep. If he didn't get her warm soon, she wouldn't wake up. "I am not going back," she whispered, her eyes trying to focus on his face but failing. "Don't let them take me. Nobody is taking you," Caleb said. He unbuttoned his heavy sheepskin coat and opened it wide. He lifted her up, shocked by how little she weighed. She felt fragile, like a bundle of dry sticks that would snap under the slightest pressure. He pulled her against his chest, wrapping his coat around both of them, trying to share what little heat he had. For a moment, he just held her there in the screaming dark. It was the first time he had held a woman in years, and there was no romance in it, only a fierce, desperate drive to keep a small flame from flickering out. But as her head lolled against his shoulder, something in Caleb's chest tightened, a searing mark of responsibility that branded him right then and there. "We have to go," he told her, though he knew she couldn't understand. He lifted her fully into his arms. He gritted his teeth against the strain in his back and leg, carried her to his horse, and managed to hoist her into the saddle. He swung up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist to keep her upright, burying her face in the fur of his collar. "Let us go, boy," he urged the horse. "Find the cabin." The line cabin was little more than a scar on the side of the foothills, a low structure of rough-hewn logs half buried in a drift. It had been built by cattlemen 20 years ago and abandoned to the rats and the spiders, but it had a roof and a stone chimney. Caleb kicked the door open, carrying Eliza inside. The air within was stale and frigid, colder in some ways than the wind outside because it was a still, dead cold. He laid her on the single wooden bunk in the corner, which was piled with dry pine boughs and a rotting mattress. He moved with frantic efficiency. He found the wood pile in the corner, mercifully dry, and shoved kindling into the hearth. His hands were clumsy clubs, his fingers stiff and uncooperative. He struck a match against the stone. It fizzled and died. He struck another. The flame flared, blue and orange, and caught the dry moss. "Come on," he hissed. "Burn!" The fire caught. The flames licked up the wood, casting dancing shadows on the logs. The cabin began to fill with a faint, flickering orange light. Caleb turned back to Eliza. She was shivering now, violent, whole-body tremors that rattled her teeth. Her clothes were a frozen shell. He knew what he had to do. He hesitated for only a second, the propriety of the world outside warring with the necessity of survival in here. If he left her in those wet clothes, she would die of pneumonia before morning. "Forgive me, ma'am," he whispered. He approached the bunk. His hands, usually so steady with a rope or a gun, trembled slightly as he undid the buttons of her coat. He peeled the sodden gray wool away. Beneath it, her dress was soaked through, clinging to her skin like a second, freezing skin. He worked quickly, keeping his eyes on his task, trying to detach himself from the intimacy of it. He unlaced her boots, pulling them off and rubbing her numb feet briskly to get the blood moving. He unhooked the bodice of her dress. He stripped away the layers of wet fabric until she was left in her thin cotton shift. She moaned softly, a sound of distress, and tried to curl away from him. "It is all right," Caleb said, his voice low and soothing. Just getting you warm." He grabbed the dry blankets from his saddle roll, rough wool, smelling of horse and tobacco, but dry, and wrapped them around her, tucking the edges in tight. He took his own scarf, warmed it by the fire, and wrapped it around her head to dry her damp hair. He sat back on his heels, exhausted. Watching her, he felt like an intruder. He had seen the bruises on her arms, the thinness of her ribs, the scars of a hard life written on her skin. He felt a surge of anger so potent it made him dizzy. Anger at Briggs, at the men who had used her, at a world that allowed such things to happen. He built the fire up until it roared. He melted snow in a tin cup and held it to her lips, coaxing her to swallow. She coughed, choking a little, but drank. As the night wore on, the shivering stopped, replaced by a burning fever. The heat he had forced into her body seemed to ignite something volatile. Eliza began to thrash. She kicked at the blankets, muttering in a language of fear. "No, the lock is broken. He is coming in." Caleb sat on an overturned crate by the bunk, his eyes gritty with fatigue. He reached out and caught her flailing hand. "Eliza, you are safe. Don't touch me," she cried out, her eyes flying open but seeing nothing. Her gaze was fixed on the ceiling, wide and terrified. "It hurts." "Please, I don't have any more money." Caleb flinched. The words were a gut punch. He leaned closer, keeping his voice steady, a drone of comfort against the chaos in her mind. "Nobody is asking for money. Nobody is hurting you. Look at me." She didn't look. She twisted, trying to pull her hand away. "Blood. There is blood on the floor." "Thomas?" "I am here," Caleb said. He didn't know who Thomas was, but he knew the tone of grief. He stroked the damp hair back from her forehead. His calloused fingers were gentle, a contrast to the violence she was reliving. He spent the night murmuring lies that he hoped would become truths. "I won't let them in. You are safe here. The door is barred. No one touches you unless you say so." Sometime near dawn, the fever seemed to break, or at least recede. Eliza stopped thrashing. Her breathing evened out, becoming a shallow rhythm. But in the quiet, her hand moved. She reached out, blindly, her fingers seeking purchase. She found his wrist. Her grip was weak, barely a flutter, but she held on with desperation. "Don't go," she whispered, her voice a dry rasp. "It is too dark." Caleb looked down at her hand on his wrist. Her fingers were small, pale against his weathered skin. He could feel the fragile pulse in her fingertips. He had been planning to move to the other side of the cabin, to give her space, to sleep by the door. "I am not going anywhere," he said. He stayed. He sat on the crate, his back aching, his leg throbbing, watching the fire turn to embers and feeding it again. He let her hold him, an anchor in the storm, until the gray light of morning began to seep through the cracks in the logs. Eliza woke to the smell of wood smoke and old wool. Her head felt heavy, stuffed with cotton, but the terrifying heat of the fever was gone. She opened her eyes. Above her was a ceiling of rough timber, stained with soot. She was warm. Heavy blankets pinned her down. Memory returned in jagged shards. The snow, the gunshots, the cold that had eaten her bones. She sat up with a gasp, clutching the blanket to her chest. She looked down and realized she was not wearing her dress. Panic, cold and instant, flooded her veins. "Where?" "Easy," a voice said from the shadows. Eliza jerked her head around. A man was sitting by the hearth, whittling a piece of wood with a small knife. He stopped and looked up. It was the cowboy, Caleb. He looked exhausted. Dark circles bruised the skin under his eyes, and stubble darkened his jaw. But his eyes were clear and calm. "Where am I?" Eliza demanded, her voice cracking. She pulled the blanket tighter, checking herself for pain. For the familiar aches of violation, there were none, only the stiffness of the cold. "What do you want?" "We are in a line cabin, north of town," Caleb said. He set the wood and knife down slowly, showing his empty hands. "I found you in the snow. Briggs' men were closing in. I sent them away." Eliza stared at him, her mind racing. "You sent them away? Why? Because they were going to kill you, or worse, he said simply. And my clothes? She asked, the accusation sharp in her tone. They were frozen stiff. He said, You would have died. I took them off. I didn't look more than I had to, and I didn't touch anything I didn't have to. Eliza watched him, looking for the lie. She knew men. She knew the shifting eyes, the smirk of a secret kept. Caleb just looked at her, steady and grave. You were freezing, he added. I wrapped you up, that is all. Eliza slumped back against the wall, the adrenaline draining away, leaving her weak. She looked at the fire. Why? Caleb poked at the embers with a stick. I don't know, he admitted. Didn't seem right to leave you. He stood up, groaning slightly as his bad leg took his weight. He walked to a pot sitting near the fire. I melted some snow. We have beans and some dried beef. You need to eat. He ladled a portion into a tin plate and brought it to her. He didn't come too close. He set it on the edge of the bunk and stepped back, giving her room. Eliza looked at the food, her stomach cramped with hunger. She reached for the spoon, her hand shaking. Thank you, she whispered. Don't thank me yet, Caleb said, moving back to his spot by the fire. The storm is still blowing. We are snowed in. Could be days before we can move. The days that followed were a strange, suspended reality. The world outside ceased to exist, reduced to the white howl against the walls. The cabin was a tiny, dim universe of two. They fell into a rhythm born of necessity. Caleb tended the fire. He went out into the storm for brief, freezing minutes to gather firewood from the stack under the eaves. He melted snow for water. Eliza, as her strength returned, took over the cooking, such as it was. She mended a tear in Caleb's coat with a needle and thread she found in her pocket. The intimacy was unavoidable in such a small space, but it was an intimacy of survival, not romance. They were like two soldiers in a foxhole. Eliza watched him with the wary eyes of a feral cat. She watched him turn his back completely whenever she needed to use the chamber pot or adjust her dress, which had dried stiff and wrinkled. She watched him sleep by the door, his gun within reach, placing himself between her and the world. He never crowded her. He never made a comment about her appearance. He spoke little, and when he did, it was about practical things, the wood supply, the wind, the leak in the roof that dripped icy water into the corner. Slowly, the knot of terror in Eliza's chest began to loosen. It didn't disappear, but it allowed her to breathe. She realized that this man was different. He carried a heavy sadness, a silence that matched her own. One evening, after a meal of beans and stale biscuits, Caleb sat by the fire, cleaning his gun. Eliza sat on the bunk, her knees drawn up. You have a limp, she said. It was the first personal question she had asked. Caleb didn't look up. Horse rolled on me. 5 years back, Texas. Does it hurt when it is cold? He said, It is cold now. He shrugged. Life is cold. Eliza looked down at her hands. You stood up for me in the saloon. No one has ever done that. I didn't do much, Caleb said, his voice bitter. I backed down. You stayed alive. Eliza said, That is doing something. Caleb looked at her then, his eyes dark. Staying alive isn't always the hard part. Eliza, it is living with what you did to stay that way. The words hung in the air, heavy and unexplained. Eliza sensed a ghost in the room, something that haunted him just as Thomas haunted her. She didn't press. She understood the weight of the past. The fourth night was the worst. The wind shifted, screaming down the chimney, sending puffs of ash into the room. Eliza was asleep, but it was a thin, restless sleep. In her dream, she was back at the Red Lantern. Briggs was there. He was laughing, his face twisting into a demonic mask. He was reaching for her throat. You are mine, Eliza. You are bought and paid for. Suddenly, a loud crack echoed through the cabin, a heavy branch from the pine tree outside snapping under the weight of the snow and slamming against the roof. Eliza bolted upright with a scream that tore her throat. No, get off me. She was not in the cabin anymore. She was in the dark, trapped, fighting hands that were too strong. She scrambled back against the logs, clawing at the air, her breath coming in hyperventilating gasps. "Eliza!" The voice was deep and close. A shadow loomed over her. A man. She lashed out, her nails raking across fabric. "Don't touch me! Eliza! It is Caleb! It is just a branch! Wake up!" He caught her wrists. He didn't pin her down. He didn't force her. He just held her hands, firmly, creating a bridge between her panic and reality. "Eliza, look at me." She blinked, her eyes wide and unseeing, tears streaming down her face. She looked at the man holding her. The firelight danced in his eyes. They were not cruel eyes. They were terrified, but steady. "Caleb?" she choked out. "I am here," he said softly. "You are in the cabin. The storm broke a branch. That is all. Nobody is here but us." He lowered his voice, a rumble in his chest that she could feel through their joined hands. "Breathe. Just breathe. I have got you." Eliza's chest heaved. She stared at his hands holding hers. They were large, rough hands. The skin was calloused like leather. They were hands that could crush, hands that could kill. But they weren't crushing. They were grounding. They were an anchor. She stopped fighting. The adrenaline crashed, leaving her trembling violently. She slumped forward, her forehead resting against his hands. I thought they were here." She sobbed. "They aren't," Caleb said. "I promised you. The door is barred. I am watching." He didn't let go. He held her hands, rubbing his thumbs slowly over her knuckles. It was a rhythmic, soothing motion. Eliza focused on that sensation. The roughness of his palms, the warmth of his skin. For years, the touch of a man had meant theft. It had meant something was being taken from her, her dignity, her safety, her will. This touch was different. It was giving. It was pouring strength into her. She looked up at him. His face was inches from hers. He wasn't looking at her body. He was looking into her eyes, searching for the girl beneath the fear. "You are shaking," he said. "I know," she whispered. She didn't pull away. A strange, terrifying feeling unfurled in her belly. It was the hunger she had felt that first night, but stronger now. It was a longing to be held, not to be used, but to be comforted. The silence in the cabin changed. It became charged, thick with an awareness that hadn't been there before. Eliza became acutely aware of the heat radiating from him, of the smell of sage and wood smoke on his skin. She realized, with a jolt that stopped her breath, that she didn't want him to let go. Caleb seemed to sense the shift. He went still. He looked at her mouth, then quickly up to her eyes. A flicker of something raw passing behind his gaze. It was desire. Yes, but it was tempered with a profound restraint. He slowly released her hands. "You should sleep," he said, his voice husky. "Storm is dying down. We might be able to ride tomorrow." He stood up and moved back to his side of the room, putting distance between them. Eliza curled back under the blankets, but she didn't sleep. She lay there, staring at the fire, holding her own hand where he had touched it. The skin still tingled. She closed her eyes and replayed the moment, the strength of his grip, the gentleness. Outside, the wind began to fade, but inside Eliza, a new storm was just beginning. She knew, with the certainty of the turning seasons, that she would carry the memory of those rough hands for the rest of her life. Not because they had saved her from the snow, but because for one terrified moment in the dark, they had made her feel safe. The silence that followed the storm was louder than the wind had ever been. When Eliza woke on the 5th morning, the howling had ceased. She sat up in the bunk, the heavy wool blankets sliding from her shoulders, and squinted against a brilliance that stung her eyes. The sun had returned. It streamed through the cracks in the logs, cutting the gloom of the cabin with blades of pure, white light. Caleb was already up. He stood by the small window, scraping the frost from the pane with his thumbnail. He turned when he heard her stir, his silhouette dark against the glare. "The storm is broke," he said. Eliza pulled her knees to her chest. The fire was banking down, a bed of glowing coals that did little to combat the chill seeping through the walls. She looked around the cabin. For days, this 12 by 12 box had been their entire world. It had been a fortress against the death waiting outside. Now, with the sun shining, the walls seemed to shrink. The intimacy that had grown in the dark, the shared heat, the quiet murmurs, the hand-holding, suddenly felt exposed and dangerous in the light of day. Caleb walked to the hearth and poured the last of the coffee into a tin cup. He handed it to her. "We have to move," he said, his voice flat. Eliza took the cup, wrapping her hands around the warm metal. "Where?" "We are low on wood," Caleb said, listing the facts as if they were items in a ledger. "We are out of grain for the horse, and the snow has stopped, which means if Briggs sent anyone else, they will be able to cut sign on us by noon." The name Briggs made Eliza flinch. The safety of the cabin evaporated instantly. She took a sip of the bitter coffee, staring into the black liquid. "He will kill you if he finds us," she whispered. "He might try," Caleb said, "but I do not plan on being here when he looks." He crouched down, checking the strapping on his saddlebags. "There is a town about a day's ride south of here. Oak Creek. It is a ranching hub. Not much law, but enough that a man like Briggs has to step careful. I have worked there before. I know a woman who runs a boarding house. She might take you on." Eliza looked up, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. "You want to leave me there?" "I want to get you somewhere safe," Caleb corrected. "I cannot keep you in a line cabin forever. Eliza, and you cannot go back to the lantern." The choice hung in the air between them, heavy and suffocating. To go with him meant riding out into the open, exposing herself to the sky and the eyes of strangers. It meant walking into a town where she was unknown, where she would just be a woman with no money and a shadowed past. But the alternative was the mines, or a shallow grave in the snow. She looked at Caleb. He was watching her, his face impassive, but his hands were still. He was waiting for her to choose. He was not ordering her. For 3 years, men had told her where to go, when to stand, when to lie down. Caleb was giving her the terrifying weight of her own will. "I will go," she said, her voice trembling but audible. "I will ride with you." Caleb nodded once. "Finish your coffee. It is going to be a long day." The world outside was a blinding, undulating ocean of white. The snow had drifted deep against the cabin walls, burying the woodpile, and stretched out across the foothills in unbroken waves. The air was crisp and thin, so cold it felt like inhaling glass. They had only the one horse, Caleb's sturdy bay. Eliza assumed she would walk, or that she would sit behind him, clinging to his coat. Instead, Caleb shortened the stirrups. "Up you go," he said, offering his gloved hands to boost her. Eliza hesitated. "You cannot walk in this. The drifts are 3 feet deep. The horse can't carry double in this powder," Caleb said. "He will founder." "You are light. I am used to walking." He didn't wait for an argument. He lifted her easily, settling her into the saddle. He handed her the reins but kept a hold on the bridle near the bit. He did not walk ahead of her, pulling the horse like a pack mule. He walked beside the shoulder of the animal, trudging through the knee-deep snow, his breath puffing in white clouds. It was a small thing, a matter of positioning, but to Eliza, it felt momentous. He was not leading a prize he had stolen. He was walking with her. The journey was grueling. The sun, though bright, offered no heat. The wind scoured the tops of the drifts, sending snakes of powder hissing across the crust. Eliza's feet in her boots, which Caleb had dried by the fire, grew numb within the hour. They moved slowly, a dark speck in a white wilderness. They crossed a frozen creek where the ice groaned ominously under the horse's weight. Caleb keeping a hand on Eliza's knee to steady her, his eyes scanning the banks for trouble, to distract her from the cold, and perhaps to fill the silence that stretched as vast as the horizon. Caleb began to talk. He pointed a gloved hand toward a ridge where the wind had swept the rock bare. "Look there," he said over the crunch of snow. Eliza squinted. "What is it?" "Golden grass," Caleb said. "See it poking through? That is winter wheatgrass. It is tough. It sleeps under the ice all season, just waiting. As soon as the melt hits, it will be the first thing to turn green." Eliza looked at the dry, yellow stalks shivering in the wind. It looked dead to her. It looked beaten. It looks lonely, she said. It is enduring, Caleb corrected gently. Later. He stopped the horse and nodded toward the south. A herd of antelope was moving across the valley floor, a ribbon of tan and white against the snow. They moved like water, fluid and graceful. They are fast, Caleb noted. Faster than anything out here. They survive because they don't fight the land. They move with it. Eliza watched the animals. She had spent 3 years inside a room with red velvet curtains and the smell of stale cigars. She had forgotten that the world was this big. She had forgotten that there were things that lived wild and free, answering to no one. "Why are you showing me this?" she asked, looking down at him. Snow clung to his beard and the brim of his hat. He looked tired, his limp becoming more pronounced as the miles wore on. "Because the world is not just walls. Eliza," he said, not breaking his stride, "I thought maybe you needed reminding." The words settled in her chest, warm and aching. He saw her fear. He saw the way she curled inward, expecting a blow, and he was trying, in his quiet, rough way, to show her that the cage was open. But as the sun began to dip toward the jagged peaks of the Rockies, painting the snow in shades of violet and bruised blue, Eliza's anxiety returned. They were getting close to civilization. "What if they know?" she asked suddenly. Caleb did not have to ask what she meant. "Who? The people in this town. What if they know what I am? You are a woman looking for work," Caleb said firmly. "That is all they need to know." Eliza gripped the saddle horn. "It is written on me. Caleb. You can see it." Caleb stopped the horse. He looked up at her, his eyes fierce. "I see a woman who survived a blizzard. I see a woman who walked away from a man like Briggs. Anyone who sees anything else is blind." He patted her knee. A brief, heavy touch. "Keep your head up. You have nothing to apologize for." Oak Creek was a huddle of timber buildings clustered around a frozen mud street. Smoke rose from a dozen chimneys, smelling of pine and coal. There was a general store with a false front, a blacksmith shop where the ring of a hammer against iron rang out clear as a bell, and a small white church with a steeple that looked like an accusing finger pointing at the sky. Caleb led the horse down the main street. People stopped to watch them pass. A man chopping wood paused, his axe resting on the block. A woman sweeping a boardwalk leaned on her broom, her eyes narrowing as she took in Eliza's worn coat and the cowboy limping beside her. Eliza felt their gazes like physical touches. She wanted to shrink, to pull the scarf over her face, but she remembered Caleb's words. "Keep your head up." She fixed her eyes on the ears of the horse and forced her spine straight. Caleb stopped in front of a large, 2-story house painted a peeling shade of yellow. A sign swinging above the porch read, "Harper's Boarding House. Meals 50 cents. "Stay here," Caleb said. He tied the horse to the rail and walked up the steps. Eliza watched him knock. A moment later, the door opened, and a tall woman with steel-gray hair pulled into a severe bun appeared. She wore a dark dress and a white apron that looked stiff with starch. Eliza could not hear their words, but she saw the woman look past Caleb, her sharp eyes dissecting Eliza. She saw Caleb talking, gesturing with his hands, his posture respectful but insistent. The woman crossed her arms. She shook her head. Caleb spoke again, leaning in, his face serious. "Finally." The woman nodded, though she did not smile. Caleb turned and beckoned to Eliza. She slid down from the saddle, her legs trembling from exhaustion and the cold. She walked up the steps, feeling the woman's judgment radiating like heat from a stove. "This is Mrs. Harper," Caleb said. "Mrs. Harper. This is Eliza." Eliza bobbed a clumsy curtsy. "Ma'am, Mrs." Harper did not return the gesture. She had a face carved from granite, lined by years of hard work and little laughter. Her eyes were blue and piercing. "Caleb says you are hard-working, Mrs." Harper said. Her voice was dry, like rustling paper. "He says you need a place to stay and you are willing to earn it." "Yes, ma'am," Eliza said. "I can cook, I can clean, I can sew. Mrs." Harper looked at Eliza's hands. They were red and chapped, but they were slender, not the broad hands of a farm girl. "You look like a strong wind would blow you over, Mrs." Harper observed. "Scrubbing floors is not delicate work. I'm stronger than I look," Eliza said. The desperation in her voice made it sharp. "Please, I just need a chance. Mrs." Harper studied her for a long, uncomfortable silence. Then she stepped back. "We have breakfast at 6, dinner at 6. You will help with both. You will clean the rooms while the men are out working. You get a cot in the pantry and $2 a week. If I find dust on the baseboards or if you cause trouble with the boarders, you are out on the street. Do you understand?" "I understand," Eliza said. "Thank you. Go around back to the kitchen." "Mrs." Harper said, "there is hot water. Wash up. You look like you have been dragged through a knothole backwards." She closed the door. Eliza let out a breath she didn't know she was holding. She looked at Caleb. $2 a week, she said. It was a fortune. It was honest money. "It is a start," Caleb said. He looked weary, the adrenaline of the journey fading. "I will take the horse to the livery. I will be staying here too, in the bunkhouse out back." "You are staying?" Eliza asked, hope flaring in her chest. Caleb adjusted his hat. "I told you, I have worked here before. The blacksmith needs a hand for a few weeks. I figured I would stick around, just to make sure you settle in." Eliza wanted to hug him. She wanted to press her face against his coat and weep. Instead, she just nodded. "Thank you, Caleb. Go wash up." "Eliza," he said softly, "you are safe now." Safety, Eliza learned, smelled like lye soap and beeswax. For the next 2 weeks, Eliza threw herself into the work with a ferocity that startled even Mrs. Harper. She rose before the sun, breaking the ice on the water barrel outside the kitchen door. She kneaded dough until her arms burned, pounded dust out of rugs until the air was thick with motes, and scrubbed the pine floorboards of the boarding house on her hands and knees until her knuckles cracked and bled. She welcomed the pain. The ache in her muscles was clean. It was simple. It pushed away the memories of the lantern. When she was scrubbing, she didn't have to think. She just had to make the wood white. Life settled into a fragile rhythm. The boarding house was full of ranch hands, railroad men, and drifters. They were loud and smelled of sweat and tobacco, but they largely ignored the quiet, pale woman who refilled their coffee cups. To them, she was part of the furniture. Eliza liked being furniture. Furniture was safe. She saw Caleb every day. He was working at the smithy, shoeing horses and mending wagon wheels. She would see him in the evenings when he came into the dining room for supper. He would sit at the end of the long table, listening to the other men joke and boast, saying little, but he would catch her eye when she brought the platter of biscuits. He would give her a nod, a microscopic dip of his chin that said, "I see you. You are doing good." Sometimes, in the lull of the afternoon, she would find him chopping wood for the kitchen stove. "You are working too hard," he told her once, watching her hang heavy wet sheets on the line in the freezing wind. "I like the work," she replied, her mouth full of clothespins. "It makes me tired enough to sleep." "Are you sleeping?" he asked. "Better," she lied. She still woke up gasping, her heart racing, thinking she heard Briggs's boots in the hall. But she didn't tell him that. For a short time, it felt like she had truly escaped. She bought a new dress with her wages, a simple calico print with a high collar. She braided her hair. She started to look less like a ghost and more like a woman. But the West was a small place, and secrets were like smoke. They always found a way out. It started on a Tuesday. Eliza was at the general store, buying flour for Mrs. Harper. A woman in a fine bonnet was standing at the counter, examining a bolt of lace. She turned as Eliza walked in. The woman froze. Her eyes went wide, then narrowed into slits of recognition. Eliza felt the blood drain from her face. She knew the woman, not by name, but she had seen her. This woman's husband had been a regular at the Red Lantern. The woman had come once, screaming at the doors, pounding her fists against the wood, dragging her husband out by his ear while the girls watched from the windows. She had seen Eliza in the window. Eliza turned and fled. leaving the flour on the counter. She ran back to the boarding house, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm of ruin, ruin, ruin. By the next evening, the atmosphere in the town had shifted. It was subtle at first, a silence that fell when she walked into a room, heads leaning together in church when she walked past on the street. Then came the whispers. Whore, fallen woman, Briggs's girl, Mrs. Harper's boarders began to mutter. A few of the more respectable men packed their bags and left, offering vague excuses about moving closer to the railhead. Eliza tried to make herself smaller. She kept her eyes on the floor. She worked harder. One night, Caleb walked into the saloon down the street from the boarding house to buy a pouch of tobacco. The room was warm and loud. 3 men were standing at the bar, laughing. "I'm telling you," one man said, slapping the counter. "It is her, the one from the lantern, the one with the green eyes." "And she is staying at Harper's?" another man asked, grinning. "Maybe I should move in there. I bet the room service is special, if you know what I mean." They laughed, a crude, ugly sound that grated on Caleb's nerves like a file on bone. "And that cripple brought her here," the first man said, "acting like he is her savior, probably pimping her out himself." Caleb froze. The rage that rose in him was white-hot and blinding. It was the same rage he had felt the night he shot a man in Texas. His hand twitched toward his gun. He could turn around. He could put a bullet in the man's leg. He could smash his face into the bar. He wanted to. God, he wanted to. But he saw Eliza's face. He saw how hard she was trying. If he started a fight, if he killed a man or even hurt one, the sheriff would come. Questions would be asked. Eliza's name would be dragged through the mud in a courtroom. She would be run out of town. Caleb forced his hand to unclench. He forced his breath to steady. He paid for his tobacco, turned his collar up, and walked out. He walked into the cold night, the laughter of the men echoing in his ears, feeling like a coward and a protector all at once. The confrontation came the next morning. Eliza was in the kitchen, kneading dough, when Mrs. Harper walked in. She did not look at the dough. She looked at Eliza. "Mrs. Evans spoke to me at the market today." "Mrs." Harper said without preamble. Eliza stopped. Her hands sank into the soft, white mound. She did not turn around. "She says you worked at the Red Lantern." "Mrs." Harper said. "She says you are that you sold yourself." Eliza closed her eyes. She could lie. She could say the woman was mistaken. She could say it was a cousin, a sister, anyone but her, but she was tired of lying. The lie was a weight she could no longer carry. She wiped her flour-dusted hands on her apron and turned to face Mrs. Harper. She lifted her chin. "She is right," Eliza said. "I worked there." "Mrs." Harper's lips thinned. "You didn't tell me. You didn't ask," Eliza said. "You asked if I could work. I run a respectable house." "Eliza, I cannot have." "Reputation matters. I did what I had to do," Eliza said, her voice shaking but defiant. "My brother was dying. I needed money for medicine. I borrowed it from a man who wouldn't let me pay it back with anything but myself. I didn't choose it, but I survived it. If that makes me unfit to scrub your floors, then tell me to go." "Mrs." Harper stared at her. For a long moment, the only sound was the crackle of the wood in the stove. "Mrs." Harper looked at the defiant tilt of Eliza's chin, the raw honesty in her green eyes. She saw the scars of a hard life, scars she perhaps recognized from her own history. "Mrs." Harper sighed, a sound that seemed to deflate her rigid posture. "3 men left this morning," she said. "I am sorry," Eliza whispered. "Mrs." Harper walked over to the stove and poured herself a cup of coffee. "I don't care about Mrs. Evans. She is a gossip and a harpy. But this is a small town. Eliza, people are small-minded." She took a sip. "You are the best worker I have ever had. The floors haven't been this clean since my husband died." She looked at Eliza. "You can stay, but I cannot stop them from talking. And if the business fails, I cannot keep you. You understand?" Eliza let out a breath, a sob catching in her throat. "Yes, thank you, Mrs." Harper turned to leave, then paused. "You are a brave girl," Eliza, but bravery doesn't always stop a stone from being thrown. Watch yourself. That evening, the cold was bitter. Caleb found Eliza on the back porch of the boarding house. She was hugging her arms around herself, staring out at the snowy street, her breath pluming in the dark. She looked small. Defeated? Eliza? Caleb said softly, stepping onto the wood planks. She didn't turn. Mrs. Harper knows. She said, I figured. Caleb said. He leaned against the railing beside her. Did she sack you? No, but she might have to. Eliza turned to him. Her eyes were wet. Every time someone looks at me, Caleb, I hear it. I hear what they are thinking. There goes the whore. There goes the trash. I scrub my skin until it is raw, but I cannot get it off. I'm never going to be clean to them. Caleb looked out at the dark shapes of the houses. I killed a boy, he said. Eliza blinked, the confession stopping her tears. What? It was in Texas, Caleb said, his voice low and distant. The Lincoln County War. I was riding for the Chisholm outfit. We were pinned down in an arroyo. Bullets were flying everywhere. I saw a rifle flash from the brush. I fired. He paused, rubbing his thumb over the scarred wood of the railing. When the shooting stopped, I went to look. It was a kid. Couldn't have been more than 16. He wasn't even shooting at me. He was just scared, firing into the air. He looked at Eliza. His brother was the foreman of the other outfit. He swore he would see me hang. He put it out that I executed the boy, that I shot him in cold blood while he was surrendering. That is not true, Eliza whispered. Doesn't matter what is true, Caleb said. Matters what people say. I had to leave Texas. Everywhere I went, the story followed me. There goes the baby killer. There goes the butcher. He turned to her, his eyes intense. I spent 5 years running from a lie, Eliza. I let it eat me up. I thought I was what they said I was. But I learned something. What? She asked. That the only person who has to live in your skin is you. He said, they can talk. Let them talk. They don't know what it was like in that wagon with your brother. They don't know what it was like in that cabin. You do. Eliza looked at him. She saw the pain etched into his face, the weight he carried. It mirrored her own. They were two broken things, trying to stand up in a world that wanted to keep them down. She felt a sudden, aching closeness to him. The distance between them collapsed. Come with me, Caleb said suddenly. Where? The barn. It is freezing out here. They walked to the barn behind the house. It was warm inside, smelling of hay and horses. Caleb lit a lantern and hung it on a nail. The golden light pushed back the shadows. From the house next door, faint music drifted through the walls. Someone was playing a fiddle, a slow, mournful waltz. Shenandoah. Caleb took his hat off and set it on a bale of hay. He turned to Eliza. Dance with me, he said. Eliza stared at him. Here? Now? Why not? Caleb said. He held out his hand. His palm was open, rough and scarred. Eliza's heart pounded. She looked at his hand. For years, men's hands had been demands. Take this. Do this. Be this. Caleb's hand was an invitation. She reached out and placed her hand in his. His fingers closed around hers, warm and solid. He pulled her gently closer. He placed his other hand on her waist. He did not pull her tight. He left space between them, respectful space. They began to sway to the muffled music. The straw crunched softly under their boots. They moved in a small circle in the lantern light. Eliza looked up at him. His face was shadowed, but his eyes were locked on hers. He looked at her with such intensity that her breath caught. She rested her head against his chest. She could hear his heart beating through his heavy coat. Thump, 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 thump. It was a steady, reassuring rhythm. She felt safe. For the first time in forever, she felt like a woman in the arms of a man, not a product in the hands of a buyer. The music swelled. Caleb's hand on her waist slid up slightly, resting between her shoulder blades. It was a tender touch. He stopped moving. Eliza lifted her head. They were standing very close now. The air between them was thick, charged with the same electricity that had been in the cabin, but stronger now. Caleb's gaze dropped to her lips. Then back to her eyes. He leaned down, slowly, giving her every second to pull away. Eliza felt a rush of heat. She wanted him. She wanted to erase the memory of every other man with the touch of this one. She tilted her face up. His lips brushed hers, soft as a moth's wing. And then the panic hit. It was not a thought. It was a reflex, a memory of stale whiskey breath, of rough stubble, of weight pinning her down. The feeling of being trapped, the feeling of a cage door slamming shut. "No!" Eliza gasped. She shoved him away, stumbling back into a stack of hay bales. She wiped her mouth with the back of her hand, her eyes wide with horror. "I cannot!" she cried. "I cannot do it!" She expected anger. She expected him to grab her, to demand why she had led him on. Caleb didn't move. He stood where he was, his hands raised slightly, palms out. "It is all right, Eliza," he said. His voice was calm, though she could see the tension in his jaw, the hurt in his eyes. "I am dirty," she sobbed, shaking her head. "I am broken. Caleb, I don't know how to be. I don't know how to want it without feeling like I am back there." Caleb lowered his hands. "You are not dirty," he said fiercely. "You are wounded. There is a difference." He took a step toward her, but stopped when she flinched. "I am sorry," she wept. "I want to, I do, but I cannot." "Then we wait," Caleb said. He looked at her with a patience that broke her heart. "We go at your pace, Eliza. I don't want you if it costs you your peace. I don't want anything from you that you don't give freely. If that takes a month, fine. If it takes 10 years, fine." Eliza looked at him through her tears. He meant it. He really meant it. The desire was still there, a knot of heat in her chest, but it was tangled with the fear. It was a bittersweet pain. She realized then how deeply she loved him, and how terrifying that love was, because now she had something to lose. "I am sorry," she whispered again. "Stop apologizing," Caleb said gently. "Come here. No kissing. Just stand with me." Eliza hesitated, then took a step forward. Caleb opened his arms. She stepped into them, burying her face in his chest. He held her, his chin resting on the top of her head. They stood there in the barn, swaying slightly as the music faded into silence. Two scarred people holding each other up against the dark. Outside, the wind picked up again, whistling around the eaves, whispering that the storm wasn't truly over yet. The past was not done with them. But for tonight, they held the line. The town of Oak Creek, which had initially seemed like a sanctuary of pine and honest labor, began to close in around Eliza like a fist slowly tightening. The change was not sudden. It was a creeping frost that started at the edges of the community and worked its way inward, chilling the air wherever she walked. It began with the boarders at Mrs. Harper's house, two railroad men, who had previously tipped their hats to Eliza when she poured their coffee, packed their bags on a Tuesday morning. They did not look her in the eye. They mumbled to Mrs. Harper about needing to be closer to the depot, but Eliza heard them on the porch as they left. They spoke of bad influences and tainted meat, their voices low and ugly. Mrs. Harper said nothing, but the lines around her mouth deepened. The loss of 2 paying guests was a blow the widow could ill afford. She scrubbed the empty room with a ferocity that spoke of her anxiety, and every scour of the brush sounded to Eliza like an accusation. Sunday brought the judgment out of the shadows and into the light. Eliza had not wanted to go to church. The idea of sitting among the townspeople, exposed and vulnerable, made her stomach turn. But Mrs. Harper insisted. In a town like this, absence from the service was as good as a confession of guilt. So Eliza went, wearing her high-collared calico dress, her hair pulled back severely, trying to look invisible. She sat in the very last pew, her hands folded white-knuckled in her lap. The air in the small white chapel smelled of damp wool, beeswax, and judgment. The preacher, a thin man with eyes like burnt coal named Reverend Thomas, stood behind the pulpit. He did not look directly at Eliza, but his voice seemed to find her in the crowded room, seeking her out like a heat-seeking wind. "We speak of forgiveness," the Reverend thundered, his hand slamming down on the good book. We speak of mercy, but let us not be deceived by false repentance. There are those who walk among us in sheep's clothing, seeking to hide the wolves of their past. They bring the stain of the world into our godly homes. Eliza stared at the back of the bonnet of the woman in front of her. She felt the heat rising in her neck, a burning flush of humiliation that no amount of prayer could cool. "The Bible tells us that the wicked shall not prosper," the Reverend shouted. "You cannot wash away the sins of the flesh with a little water and a change of a dress. The Lord sees. The Lord knows what is done in the dark corners of the night." The congregation shifted in their seats, heads turned slightly. Whispers hissed through the room like steam escaping a valve. Eliza felt hundreds of eyes boring into her skin, stripping away her dress, her dignity, her attempt at a new life. She sat with her spine rigid, refusing to cry, refusing to run, though every instinct screamed at her to bolt for the door. When the service ended, the exit was a gauntlet. As Eliza walked down the steps, the crowd parted around her as if she were carrying a plague. Women she had bought flour from at the mercantile turned their backs, suddenly engrossed in conversation. A little girl, whose dropped doll Eliza had retrieved just 3 days prior, started to wave. Her mother, a stout woman with a pinched face, grabbed the child's arm and yanked her back so violently the girl stumbled. "Don't you look at her. Sarah," the mother hissed, loud enough for half the street to hear. "You stay away from that filth." Eliza kept walking, her gaze fixed on the muddy ruts of the road. She felt dirty. She felt as though the Reverend was right, that her very presence was a contamination. Caleb was waiting for her at the bottom of the hill. He had not gone into the church. He had little use for sermons that preached love while practicing hate. He saw the mother pull the child away. He saw the way the men on the mercantile porch spat tobacco juice near Eliza's hem as she passed, his jaw set like iron. He stepped forward, placing himself between Eliza and the town. "Morning, Mrs. Gable," Caleb said to the mother, tipping his hat. His voice was pleasant, but his eyes were hard as flint. "Fine day for teaching children manners, isn't it?" The woman huffed, clutching her daughter close, and hurried away without a word. Caleb fell in step beside Eliza. He did not touch her. He knew that would only fuel the fire, but his presence was a shield. "Ignore them," he murmured. "They are sheep, Eliza. They only know how to baa when the shepherd tells them to. It is not just noise." "Caleb," Eliza whispered, her voice tight. "It is hatred." It escalated over the next week. Caleb began coming back to the boarding house with fresh marks on him. A split lip one evening, a bruised set of knuckles the next. He dismissed them as slips of the hammer at the smithy or a stubborn horse, but Eliza knew better. She knew he was fighting for her. She sat him down one evening in the kitchen, dipping a cloth into a bowl of cool water to dab at a cut over his eye. "You have to stop," she said, her hands trembling slightly as she touched his face. "Stop what?" Caleb asked, wincing slightly as the water hit the raw skin. "Fighting them. Defending me. It only makes them angrier." "I'm not going to let them talk about you like that," Caleb said. "I don't care if I have to fight every man in Oak Creek." "And what happens when you are too hurt to work?" Eliza asked. "What happens when they decide to do more than talk? You are getting hurt because of me. Caleb, everyone gets hurt because of me." Caleb reached up and caught her hand, stopping her ministrations. "You are not the one hurting me. Eliza, they are—" Do not confuse the victim with the villain, but Eliza could not separate them. The guilt lay heavy in her gut, a stone that grew heavier with every dark look she received in the street. Then, the law arrived. It was a Tuesday afternoon when the sheriff rode into town. He was not the local constable, who was an old man mostly concerned with drunks and stray dogs. This was Sheriff Kincaid, a man whose jurisdiction covered the wider territory, including the mining districts. Kincaid was a broad-shouldered man with a thick mustache and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He rode a tall black horse and wore a badge that gleamed too brightly in the winter sun. He tied his horse at the rack in front of the saloon and spent an hour inside. When he came out, he walked straight toward the boarding house. Eliza was sweeping the front porch. She saw him coming and stopped. her broom clutched in her hands like a weapon she didn't know how to use. She recognized the walk. It was the walk of a man who owned the ground he stepped on. He stopped at the foot of the stairs and looked up at her. "Eliza, isn't it?" Kincaid asked. His voice was smooth, carrying the false warmth of a politician. Eliza nodded, unable to speak. "I have been looking for you," Kincaid said, resting a hand on his gun belt. "Mr. Briggs has been very worried. He was afraid you had met with foul play in the storm." "I am fine," Eliza said, her voice barely a whisper. "I am working here." Kincaid chuckled. "A dry sound. Working. Yes. Well, the thing is, Eliza, you have a contract. Mr. Briggs showed it to me. It says you owe him a significant sum, and that your labor belongs to him until that sum is paid. I paid him," Eliza said, finding a sudden spark of defiance. "I worked for 3 years. I paid him 10 times over what I borrowed. Interest is a tricky thing," Kincaid said. "Mounting the first step, and breach of contract is a crime." "Eliza, especially when you steal from your employer before you run." "I didn't steal. Briggs says you took money from the till. That was my money. Money I saved." Kincaid shrugged. "That is for a judge to decide. And seeing as the nearest judge is a long ride away, my duty is to return the property to its owner until such time as a hearing can be held." He pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket and waved it. "This is a warrant. Eliza, you are coming with me." Eliza froze. The street seemed to tilt. People were stopping to watch. She saw the mercantile owner watching from his window. She saw Mrs. Gable pause on the boardwalk. They were all watching, and none of them moved. To them, this was justice. This was the trash being taken out. "I am not going back," Eliza gasped, backing up until her spine hit the wall of the house. Kincaid took another step up. "I don't think you have a choice, darling." "Now, don't make a scene. It is unbecoming." He reached for her arm. Suddenly, a figure vaulted over the porch railing from the side yard. Caleb landed between Eliza and the sheriff, his boots thudding heavy on the planks. He was dusty from the smithy, his face streaked with soot, his eyes blazing. "Back off, Kincaid," Caleb snarled. Kincaid stopped, his hand hovering in the air. He looked Caleb up and down, noting the limp, the scar, the tension in the cowboy's frame. "Well now," Kincaid drawled, "you must be the boyfriend, the one causing all the trouble." "She is not property," Caleb said, his voice low and dangerous. "You cannot own a person. That war was fought and finished 20 years ago. Contracts are binding." "Son," Kincaid said, his smile fading into a flat line. "And obstructing a lawman is a felony. Step aside." "She is not going with you," Caleb said. He didn't move. He stood like a boulder in a stream, immovable. Kincaid's hand dropped to the butt of his pistol. "You plan on fighting the law by yourself. Cowboy, you think these fine folks are going to help you?" He gestured to the street. The townspeople watched in silence. No one stepped forward. No one spoke up. Caleb didn't look at them. He kept his eyes on Kincaid. "I don't need them. I am telling you, you are not touching her." The tension stretched, thin and humming like a wire about to snap. Kincaid was calculating. He could shoot Caleb. He could claim self-defense, but shooting a man in broad daylight on a porch with witnesses was messy, even for him. The front door opened. Mrs. Harper stepped out. She was pale, wiping her hands on her apron, but she stepped out. "Sheriff, Mrs. Harper said, her voice shaking but audible. "Eliza is in my employ. She is working off her room and board. If you take her, you are leaving me without help in the middle of the season." Kincaid looked at Mrs. Harper. He tipped his hat, mocking her. "Mrs. Harper, is it? I would be careful. Ma'am, harboring a fugitive can get a business shut down. Licenses can be revoked. Taxes can be reassessed. Mrs. Harper swallowed hard, her throat clicking, but she didn't retreat. "She is my employee," she repeated. Kincaid looked from Caleb to Mrs. Harper, then back to Eliza, who was pressed against the wall. Trembling, he smiled, a cold, shark-like expression. "All right," he said, lowering his hand from his gun. I'm a reasonable man. I will give you a day to get your affairs in order, Mrs. Harper. But the law is the law. That girl is going back to Granite Peak. He pointed a gloved finger at Caleb. And you. Watch your step, boy. I don't like heroes. They tend to die young. Kincaid turned and walked back down the stairs, mounting his horse with practiced ease. He rode slowly down the street, owning the silence he left behind. That night, the boarding house was quiet as a tomb. The wind rattled the panes, sounding like fingers tapping, asking to come in. Eliza sat at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a cup of cold tea. Mrs. Harper sat opposite her. The older woman looked aged 10 years since the morning. I cannot protect you. Eliza, Mrs. Harper said. Her voice was not unkind, but it was heavy with defeat. I know, Eliza whispered. He is going to come back. Mrs. Harper continued. He is a friend of Briggs. Men like that. They control everything. The water rights, the freight contracts, the law. If I stand in his way, he will burn me down. I have worked 30 years for this house. It is all I have. Eliza looked up. Mrs. Harper's eyes were wet. It was the first time Eliza had seen the woman cry. You don't have to apologize. Mrs. Harper, Eliza said, you stood up for me today. No one else did. Mrs. Harper reached across the table and squeezed Eliza's hand. You need to leave, child. Tonight, if you are here when he comes back, where will I go? Eliza asked, the despair crashing over her. He will have men watching the roads. I don't know, Mrs. Harper admitted, but you cannot stay here. You are good. Eliza, you deserve better than this. But I am just an old woman. I cannot fight an army. Eliza nodded. She understood. Survival was a cruel master. She went to her pantry room. She didn't pack. She just sat on the edge of her cot, staring at the wall. The guilt was a physical weight in her chest. Mrs. Harper was terrified. The boarding house was in danger. Caleb was marking himself for death. Every person who showed her kindness was punished for it. She was the poison. The door opened softly. It was Caleb. He came in and sat beside her on the narrow cot. He didn't ask if she was all right. He knew she wasn't. We are leaving, he said. What? Tonight, Caleb said. I have the horses ready. We will cut west into the high passes. Kincaid won't follow us there in winter. It is too rough. Caleb, we cannot, Eliza said, turning to him. You heard him. He will hunt us. He will hurt Mrs. Harper just to spite us. Let him try, Caleb said, his eyes dark. You cannot fight the whole world. Caleb, Eliza cried, her voice cracking. Look at you. You are limping. Your hands are cut. You're going to get yourself killed for a woman the whole town thinks is trash. I don't care what the town thinks. Caleb grabbed her shoulders. I care about you. Why? Eliza sobbed. Why do you care? I am nothing but trouble. I am a millstone around your neck. You should have left me in the snow. Don't you ever say that, Caleb said fiercely. He pulled her into him, holding her tight. You are the best thing I have found in years, Eliza. You are the only thing that makes sense. Eliza clung to him, smelling the leather and soap on his skin. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to run away with him into the mountains and live in a cabin and never see another human soul. But she knew Kincaid. She knew Briggs. They wouldn't stop. They would burn Mrs. Harper's house. They would hunt Caleb down and hang him for a horse thief or a murderer. And they would laugh while they did it. If she went with him, she was signing his death warrant. We will figure it out, Caleb whispered into her hair. You get some sleep. I will keep watch. He kissed her forehead and left the room to stand guard on the porch. Eliza sat in the dark, the tears drying on her cheeks, her heart breaking into jagged shards. The trap sprung the next morning. Caleb had gone to the saloon to buy supplies for their flight, whiskey for medicine, matches, tobacco. He was trying to be quick. He was standing at the bar when a man bumped into him hard from behind. It was one of the loafers, a man named Deke who did odd jobs for the sheriff. Watch it, cripple, Deke sneered. Caleb stepped away. Excuse me, Deke shoved him again. I said, watch it. You stepped on my boot. I didn't step on anything, Caleb said, sensing the setup but unable to avoid it. You calling me a liar? Deke shouted. He swung a wild punch. Caleb dodged it easily. He grabbed Deke's arm and spun him, pushing him away. He didn't hit him. He just neutralized the threat. Suddenly, the doors burst open. Kincaid was there, gun drawn, as if he had been waiting on the boardwalk for a cue. That is enough, Kincaid roared. He walked in, looking at Deke, who was sprawling on the floor, feigning agony. He attacked me. Sheriff, Deke whined. He tried to break my arm. I saw it. Kincaid lied smoothly. Unprovoked assault, and resisting a peaceful citizen. He turned the gun on Caleb. Put your hands up. Cowboy, it is a setup. Kincaid, Caleb said, his voice cold. And you know it. Doesn't matter what I know. Kincaid smiled. Matters what the judge hears. Assault, disturbing the peace, public intoxication. I can keep you in a cell for 6 months before a circuit judge even rides through here. 2 deputies moved in from the back room, grabbing Caleb's arms. Caleb struggled, rage flaring. But with a gun in his face and 2 men holding him, he was powerless. They dragged him out of the saloon and across the street to the small brick jailhouse. News traveled fast. Eliza was in the kitchen when a boy ran past the window, shouting that the sheriff had arrested the cowboy. Eliza's blood ran cold. She ran out the front door, just in time to see the heavy iron door of the jail slam shut. She ran to the barred window on the side of the jailhouse. Caleb, Eliza, go back! Caleb's voice came from the dark cell. Go back to Mrs. Harper's! Kincaid stepped around the corner of the building, picking his teeth with a splinter of wood. Now! Now! He clucked. No visiting hours yet. Let him go! Eliza screamed, rushing at him. He didn't do anything. Kincaid caught her wrist easily, twisting it just enough to hurt. He pulled her close, the smell of stale tobacco and bay rum overwhelming her. He is in a lot of trouble. Eliza, Kincaid said, his voice dropping to a whisper. Assaulting a local? That is serious. And with his reputation, well, accidents happen in jail. Men hang themselves. Men fall downstairs. Eliza stopped struggling, terror seizing her throat. What do you want? I want what is rightfully Mr. Briggs's, Kincaid said. He leaned closer. Here's the deal. You come with me, quietly. No fighting. You come back to Granite Peak and fulfill your contract. And Caleb? Kincaid shrugged. If the property is returned, I see no reason to hold a grudge. I will drop the charges. He walks free. Maybe he learns a lesson about interfering in business. Eliza looked at the barred window. She couldn't see Caleb, but she could feel him there in the dark. If I go, you will let him go? She asked. You promise? I am a man of the law. Kincaid smiled. I keep my word. But if you run, if you fight, he stays in there. And maybe he doesn't come out walking. Eliza looked at the town, the gray sky, the people watching from the windows. She looked at Mrs. Harper's house, which was safe only as long as she wasn't in it. She realized then that there was no escape. There was no cabin in the mountains. There was no future with golden grass and antelope. There was only the debt and the hunger and the power of men like Kincaid. But she could save him. She could save the man who had saved her. I will go, she whispered. Good girl, Kincaid said. He released her wrist. We leave at dawn. Have your things ready. And don't tell the cowboy. If he makes a scene, the deal is off. Eliza did not sleep. The night was a long, suffocating tunnel. She packed her meager belongings, the calico dress, a hairbrush, the scarf Caleb had given her. She sat on the cot and took a piece of paper and a pencil stub. She tried to write. Her hand shook so badly the lead snapped twice. She wanted to tell him everything. She wanted to tell him that she loved him, that his touch was the only thing that had ever made her feel holy. She wanted to tell him that she was doing this for him. But if she told him that, he would come after her. He would die trying to save her. She had to make him let her go. She wrote, Caleb, I cannot do this anymore. The town is too hard. The shame is too much. I am going back to where I belong. It is the only way to make things right. Don't come looking for me. Please just live your life. Eliza, it was a lie. It was a cruel, jagged lie, but it was the only shield she had left to give him. She folded the note and placed it on the pillow of her cot. At first light, the sky was the color of a bruise. A covered wagon waited at the end of the street, guarded by two of Kincaid's deputies. Eliza walked out of the boarding house. She didn't look back. If she looked back, she would crumble. She climbed into the back of the wagon. It smelled of canvas and old dust. Kincaid was on his horse. He nodded to her. "Let us ride," he ordered. The wagon lurched forward. The wheels ground over the frozen ruts with a sound like bones breaking. Eliza pulled her knees to her chest in the dark of the canvas cover. As the wagon rolled out of town, heading north toward the mountains and the mines, she didn't cry. She was past crying. She was hollow. She closed her eyes and focused on one thing, the memory of Caleb's heartbeat against her ear in the barn. She locked that memory away in a box in the center of her mind. A tiny, secret flame to keep her from freezing in the long night ahead. 2 hours later, the heavy iron key turned in the lock of the jail cell. The door swung open. Kincaid stood there, looking bored. "Get out," he said. Caleb stood up from the cot. He was stiff, his muscles coiled tight. "What is this? Charges are dropped," Kincaid said. Witness recanted. Said he might have tripped. "You are free to go." Caleb narrowed his eyes. He didn't trust it. Kincaid wasn't a man who let things go. "Why?" Caleb asked. "Maybe I am feeling generous." Kincaid smirked. "Or maybe the problem solved itself. Get out of my town, cowboy, before I change my mind." Caleb walked out of the cell, brushing past Kincaid. He stepped into the street. The sun was up, but the air was cold. He felt a sudden, sickening lurch in his gut. The problem solved itself. He ran despite his bad leg, sprinting down the muddy street to the boarding house. He burst through the front door. "Mrs. Harper!" The widow appeared from the kitchen, looking pale and frightened. "Caleb? They let you go. Where is she?" Caleb demanded. "Where is Eliza?" "She is in her room." "Mrs. Harper said she didn't come down for breakfast." "I thought she was sleeping." Caleb didn't wait. He tore down the hall and threw open the door to the pantry room. It was empty. The cot was made. The small bundle of clothes was gone. On the pillow, a piece of paper sat like a white flag of surrender. Caleb walked over and picked it up. His hands were shaking. He read the words, "I am going back to where I belong." "No," he whispered. "No." He crushed the paper in his fist. He knew instantly what had happened. She hadn't left because she wanted to. She hadn't left because of the shame. She had traded herself. She had bought his freedom with her own. A roar built in Caleb's chest, a sound of pure, animal fury. He kicked the cot, sending it crashing against the wall. He slammed his fist into the doorframe, splintering the wood. The rage was blinding. It was the old rage, the killer's rage. He wanted to burn the town. He wanted to find Kincaid and tear him apart with his bare hands. He wanted to watch the world bleed for what it had done to her. He stood there, panting, his knuckles bleeding, the red haze clouding his vision. Then he remembered. He remembered her hand in his. He remembered her voice in the cabin. "I don't know how to want without feeling dirty." She had sacrificed herself because she thought she was cursed. She thought she was saving him. The rage cooled, hardening into something colder and more durable. It settled into his bones like iron. He was not going to burn the town. That was what the old Caleb would have done. He walked out of the room, past a terrified Mrs. "Harper, where are you going?" she gasped. "I'm going to get her back," Caleb said. His voice was quiet, terrifyingly calm. He walked to the livery stable. He saddled his horse. He checked his Winchester. He counted his shells. He mounted up and rode to the edge of town, looking at the fresh wagon tracks cutting deep into the mud, heading north toward the dark peaks of the mining district. Kincaid thought he had won. Briggs thought he had his property back. They thought Caleb was just a drifter who would take his freedom and run. They were wrong. Caleb touched the scar on his side. He looked at the mountains. "I am coming, Eliza," he whispered to the wind. He spurred the horse, riding hard into the teeth of the winter. a man with nothing left to lose and everything to save. He would ride through hell to find her, and God help the men who stood in his way. Caleb stood in the center of the livery stable, the air smelling of wet hay and horse sweat. He looked at his spare saddle, a good piece of leather he had tooled himself during long nights by the fire in Texas. It was worth $40 easily. He sold it to the stable master for $15. He did not haggle. He did not have the time. With the money heavy in his pocket, he moved through the town of Oak Creek with a grim efficiency that frightened the few people who looked him in the eye. He bought 3 boxes of ammunition for his Winchester. He bought jerked beef, a bag of coffee, and a heavy wool blanket. He went to the mercantile and bought a map of the Northern Territory. Though he knew the mountains were treacherous enough to make any paper map a suggestion at best, he was preparing for war. Not a war of armies, but a war against the land, and against the men who thought they owned it. When he returned to Mrs. Harper's boarding house to collect his bedroll, he found the widow waiting for him on the back porch. She looked small in the gray light, her hands twisted in her apron. "You are going after her?" Mrs. Harper stated. It was not a question. "I am," Caleb said. He tightened the cinch on his bay gelding, checking the straps with methodical care. "Mrs.?" Harper stepped forward. Her severe face, usually so composed, crumpled slightly. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small packet wrapped in oilcloth and a thick, gray wool scarf. "Here," she said, thrusting them into his hands. "It is ham and biscuits. And the scarf? It belonged to my husband. It is warm." Caleb took the items. He looked at the scarf, then at the woman who had risked her livelihood to stand on a porch and defy a sheriff. "Thank you, ma'am," he said softly. "Bring her back." "Caleb." "Mrs." Harper whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "She is a good girl. She deserves someone who will come for her. God knows not many of us get that." Caleb wound the scarf around his neck. It smelled of cedar and lavender. "I will bring her back," he promised, "or I will die trying." He swung into the saddle, the leather creaking in the cold air. He touched the brim of his hat, turned the horse's head north, and rode out of Oak Creek. He did not look back. The town that had judged them was behind him. Ahead lay the mountains, white and unforgiving. The high country was a world stripped of mercy. As Caleb rode higher, the rolling foothills gave way to jagged peaks that tore at the sky. The open prairie vanished, replaced by narrow canyons where the wind screamed like a trapped spirit. The air grew thin, burning his lungs with every inhalation. The snow here was not the soft blanket of the plains. It was hard-packed ice, slick and treacherous, hiding crevices that could swallow a horse whole. Caleb rode with his eyes scanning the ground, trusting the bay gelding's instincts as much as his own. The silence was absolute. There were no birds, no rustle of dry grass, just the sound of the wind in the pines and the crunch of hooves. It weighed on him. This vast emptiness. It gave him too much time to think. He thought of Eliza in the wagon, freezing in the dark. He thought of the note she had left. "I am going back to where I belong." It was a lie that burned him more than the cold. She believed she belonged in the dark because that was where the world had shoved her. He camped in the lee of rock falls, building small, smokeless fires that offered barely enough heat to thaw his hands. His fingers cracked and bled, the skin splitting in the dry cold. His breath frosted inside Mrs. Harper's scarf, turning the wool into a mask of ice. On the third night, huddled under his blankets while the temperature dropped to 20 degrees below zero, the doubt came. It whispered that he was a fool. It whispered that he was riding to his death for a woman who had walked away. It whispered that he was just a violent man looking for an excuse to use his gun again. But then he remembered the cabin. He remembered the way she had gripped his wrist in her sleep. He remembered the look in her eyes in the barn, the terror warring with a hunger so deep it terrified her. She had not walked away. She had been dragged away by her own conscience. "I am not leaving you. Eliza." He spoke aloud to the empty darkness. His voice was raspy, swallowed instantly by the wind. "You do not face the nightmares alone. Not anymore. Granite Peak was not a town. It was a wound in the earth. It clung to the side of a steep mountain slope, a chaotic sprawl of canvas tents, rough-hewn shacks, and buildings made of raw lumber that leaked sap in the summer and froze in the winter. The ground was churned into black mud mixed with coal dust and mine tailings. The air stank of sulfur, unwashed bodies, and the acrid smoke of 1,000 coal fires. The wagon carrying Eliza rattled into the main thoroughfare 2 days after leaving Oak Creek. She was stiff, her body bruised from the relentless jolting. She peered out through the gap in the canvas. Men swarmed the streets like ants, miners covered in soot, gamblers in flashy waistcoats, rough-looking men with guns on their hips. There was a frantic, desperate energy here. Everyone was looking for gold, for silver, for a way out, or for a way to forget. The wagon stopped in front of a large, 2-story building with a false front painted a gaudy yellow. A sign hung above the double doors. The Silver Star. "Get out," Kincaid ordered, riding up beside the wagon. Eliza climbed down, her legs shaking as her boots hit the frozen mud. She looked up at the building. It was bigger than the Red Lantern, but it lacked even the thin veneer of civility Briggs's old place had maintained. The windows were grime-streaked. The sounds of shouting and breaking glass drifted from inside, even in the middle of the day. Inside, the air was thick with cigar smoke and the smell of spilled beer. Briggs was waiting. He stood by the bar, looking satisfied. He looked Eliza up and down, noting the fatigue in her face, the dullness in her eyes. "Welcome home, Eliza," Briggs sneered. Eliza said nothing. She felt cold, a deep, numbing cold that had nothing to do with the winter. "Take her upstairs," Briggs commanded a large man who worked as the bouncer. "Room 4, and get her cleaned up. She starts tonight. We have lost time to make up for—" Eliza was marched up the stairs. The hallway was narrow and dark. She was shoved into a room that contained a narrow bed, a wash basin, and a single chair. The door opened again a moment later. A woman walked in carrying a pitcher of water. She was thin, her collarbones jutting out sharply against her pale skin. Her hair was dyed a harsh, brassy blonde, and her eyes were rimmed with dark shadows. "Eliza?" the woman whispered. Eliza looked up. "May?" It was May, a girl who had worked at the Red Lantern a year ago before disappearing. Briggs had said she moved on to a city. May set the pitcher down and rushed to hug Eliza. She smelled of cheap perfume and gin. Her body felt frail, like a bird skeleton. "I thought you got out," May whispered, pulling back to look at Eliza. "I heard you ran. I prayed you made it." "I didn't," Eliza said dully. May looked at the door, fear in her eyes. "It is bad here, Eliza, worse than the Lantern. The men, they are angry. They work in the dark all day, and they come here to hurt something." Eliza looked at May's face. There was a bruise on her jaw, poorly covered with powder. Her eyes were hollow, stripped of hope. This was what the nights of hunger did to a woman. They ate her from the inside out until there was nothing left but a shell. "I know," Eliza said. "That first night was a descent into hell." Eliza was forced into a dress that was too tight and pushed into the main saloon. The piano played a frantic, discordant tune. Men grabbed at her as she passed. She served drinks. She dodged hands. She endured the stares that stripped her naked. Every laugh sounded like a threat. Every slammed door sounded like a gunshot. Later, a miner paid for her time. He was rough, smelling of earth and sweat. Eliza dissociated. She stared at the crack in the ceiling, floating above her own body, locking her mind away in the box where she kept the memory of the barn. When it was over, she lay in the dark, shivering. She closed her eyes and summoned him. Caleb. She remembered the weight of his coat around her in the snow. She remembered his voice, low and steady, telling her to breathe. She remembered the almost kiss, the way he had stopped because she asked him to. He had promised her safety. He had offered her a choice. The ache of missing him was sharper than any physical pain. It was a hunger that clawed at her throat. She didn't just miss his protection. She missed him. She missed the man who looked at winter wheatgrass and saw endurance. 2 nights later, during a lull in the early evening, Eliza sat in the back room with May and 3 other women. They were sewing tears in their dresses, sharing a bottle of stolen whiskey. Eliza told them. She hadn't meant to, but the silence was too heavy. "He found me in the blizzard," Eliza said softly, threading a needle. "He carried me to a cabin." May stopped drinking. "A cowboy?" Eliza nodded. "He built a fire. He warmed my hands. We were snowed in for 4 days. "And?" another woman asked, leaning forward. "What did he do?" "He cooked beans," Eliza said, a faint smile touching her lips for the first time in days. "He fixed the roof. He held my hand when I had nightmares. He didn't take anything?" May asked, skeptical. "No," Eliza said. "He said he wouldn't touch me unless I wanted him to." "And he meant it." May sat back, shaking her head. "He is a fool." She said, "No," Eliza said firmly. "He is a good man. He is a saint." "Then," May corrected, her voice wistful, "I didn't think they made those anymore." The other women were silent. The story hung in the air, glittering like a diamond in a coal chute. It was a dangerous thing. Hope. But hearing it, knowing that a man like Caleb existed, a man who saw a woman as a person, not a thing, planted a seed in the room, it made their reality feel less inevitable. It reminded them that they were human beings who deserved better. 20 miles south of Granite Peak, the trail narrowed into a choke point called Devil's Throat. It was a slash of rock between 2 sheer cliffs, barely wide enough for a wagon. Caleb rode toward it as the sun began to fail. He saw the smoke before he saw the men. 2 riders were camped in the middle of the pass, blocking the way. They were huddled around a fire, rifles propped against a boulder. They were clearly sentries, placed there to ensure that whatever came in or out of Granite Peak was approved by Briggs and Kincaid. Caleb pulled his horse up. He could turn back, find another road over the ridge, but that would take 2 days he didn't have. He checked his Winchester. He checked the Colt on his hip. He nudged the horse forward, riding openly toward the fire. The men jumped up, grabbing their rifles. One was tall and bearded. The other was the man named Stark, the one Caleb had driven off in the blizzard weeks ago. "Well, look who it is," Stark spat, recognizing the rider. "The cripple from Oak Creek." "Hold it right there," the bearded man shouted, leveling his gun. "This is a private road." "It is a public pass," Caleb said calmly, stopping his horse 10 yards away. "Not anymore," Stark sneered. "Briggs said to keep trash out, and you look like trash to me. Turn around." "Stark," Caleb said. "I'm coming through." Stark laughed. "You got lucky in the snow. Cowboy, you ain't got the weather to hide you now." Stark raised his rifle. Caleb moved. He didn't go for the rifle. He drew the Colt from his hip with a speed that blurred the air. He fired twice. The first bullet shattered the stock of the bearded man's rifle, sending splinters into his face. The man screamed, dropping the weapon and clutching his eyes. The second bullet hit Stark in the fleshy part of his thigh. Stark yelled, his leg buckling, and his shot went wide, whistling harmlessly past Caleb's ear. Caleb spurred his horse, closing the distance in 3 strides. He leaped from the saddle, ignoring the jarring pain in his bad leg, and slammed the barrel of his pistol into Stark's temple. Stark crumpled into the snow. The bearded man was on his knees, blinded by blood and wood chips, groping for his gun. "Don't," Caleb warned, cocking the hammer of the Colt. The man froze. Caleb stood over them, his chest heaving, his breath coming in white clouds. He felt a sting in his shoulder. Stark's bullet hadn't missed entirely. It had grazed his deltoid, tearing the coat and the skin beneath. He looked at the 2 men. He could kill them. It would be easy. It would be safe. But he looked at the blood on the snow, and he felt a wave of sickness. He was done with killing for the sake of killing. "Throw your guns over the cliff," Caleb ordered the bearded man. The man obeyed, tossing the rifles and Stark's pistol into the deep ravine. "Tell Briggs I am coming," Caleb said, his voice like grinding stones. "Tell him the debt is canceled." He mounted his horse, gritting his teeth against the throb in his shoulder, and rode through the pass, leaving the men alive in the snow, shivering not just from the cold, but from the look they had seen in his eyes. Caleb reached Granite Peak under the cover of a moonless night. He didn't ride down the main street. He skirted the edge of the camp, guiding his horse into a deep ravine choked with scrub brush. He tied the animal there, covering him with a wool blanket. "Stay quiet," he whispered to the horse. He moved into the town on foot, hugging the shadows of the shacks. He found the silver star easily. It was the loudest, brightest thing in the pit. He crouched behind a pile of crates in the alleyway, watching the back entrance. He studied the layout. The kitchen door, the narrow stairs leading up to a balcony. Suddenly, the back door banged open. A man stumbled out, dragging a woman by her hair. It was May. "Get off me!" May screamed, clawing at his hand. "You took my wallet," the man shouted, drunk and violent. He slapped her hard, knocking her into the mud. "I didn't!" May cried. The man raised his boot to kick her. Caleb's hand went to his gun. The rage spiked, hot and demanding. He wanted to step out and put a bullet in the man's knee, but he stopped himself. If he fired now, the whole town would be on him. Briggs had hired guns everywhere. Kincaid was likely here. If Caleb died in an alley over a fist fight, Eliza would never get out. He watched, his heart hammering against his ribs, as another bouncer came out and pulled the drunk man away. Not to save May, but to stop the noise. May crawled back inside, sobbing. Caleb exhaled, his hands shaking. He needed help. He couldn't do this alone. He slipped away from the brothel, moving toward the rows of miners' tents. He needed to find the people who hated Briggs as much as he did. He found the camp doctor first. Doctor Aris was a man with gray skin and whiskey-stained sleeves, working in a canvas tent by lantern light. Caleb stepped in from the dark. "I am not looking for drugs," Caleb said as the doctor jumped. "Doctor," Aris looked at Caleb's bleeding shoulder. "You look like you need a suture. I need information," Caleb said, "about Briggs and Kincaid." The doctor laughed bitterly. "Everyone knows about them. Knowing doesn't stop them." "I plan to stop them," Caleb said. He sat while the doctor cleaned the graze on his shoulder. He spoke plainly. He told the doctor about Eliza. He told him about the contract fraud. The doctor listened, his eyes weary. "I have ledgers," he admitted quietly. "I patch up the girls. I write down who did it. Briggs pays Kincaid to ignore the reports. I have dates, names, payments." "Will you testify?" Caleb asked. "To who?" "The sheriff is on the payroll." "To a circuit judge," Caleb said. "I heard one is riding toward Leadville. We intercept him. We bring him here." The doctor hesitated, then nodded. "I am tired of sewing up women. Son, I will do it." They found one more ally, a miner named Silas, a giant of a man with hands like shovels. Silas had lost his wife a year ago. She had been working as a laundress for the brothel and died of pneumonia that looked a lot like a beating. Silas listened to the plan. He sharpened his pickaxe while Caleb spoke. "I will get the boys," Silas rumbled. "The decent ones. We will watch your back." The plan was set for the following day, but the devil doesn't wait for plans. The next evening, Briggs arrived at the Silver Star in a foul mood. The profits were down. The disruption in Oak Creek had cost him money. He stormed into the main saloon. He demanded the girls work harder, drink more with the customers, offer more. The tension in the room was brittle. The miners were rowdy, fueled by payday whiskey. May was serving a table near the front. A large man grabbed her, spilling his drink. He was angry about the stain. He grabbed a heavy glass bottle and swung it. It connected with the side of May's head. She dropped like a stone, blood pooling instantly on the floorboards. The room went silent for a second, then erupted in laughter from the man's friends. That snapped it. Eliza was standing by the piano. She saw May fall. She saw the blood. Something inside her broke, not the break of a collapse, but the break of chains snapping. "No!" Eliza screamed. She ran across the room. She grabbed a chair and smashed it over the man's back. The wood splintered. The man roared, turning on her. "We are not animals," Eliza shrieked, her voice cutting through the smoke. "You cannot do this. We are human beings." The saloon exploded into chaos. The man lunged for Eliza. Other miners, sensing a brawl, jumped in. Tables overturned. Fists flew. Outside, in the alley. Caleb heard the scream. He heard Eliza's voice. "Now!" he yelled to Silas and the doctor, who were waiting in the shadows. Caleb kicked the back door in. The wood shattered around the lock. He stormed into the kitchen, gun drawn. He burst into the main room. It was a riot. "Eliza!" Caleb roared. His voice cut through the din. Eliza, fighting off a man who was trying to pin her against the bar, looked up. Through the haze of smoke and dust, she saw him. He stood in the doorway, the gray scarf around his neck, his face set in a mask of fierce determination. "Caleb," she breathed. For a moment, the room disappeared. It was just them. Then, Briggs's hired guns saw him. "There he is," one shouted. "Kill him!" Gunfire erupted. Bullets chewed into the doorframe next to Caleb's head. He returned fire, dropping behind an overturned table. He levered the Winchester with a fluid, deadly rhythm. Bang, click, clack, bang, click, clack. One gunman went down, clutching his leg. Silas and a group of miners surged in through the front doors, wielding pickaxes and shovels, clashing with the bouncers. It was total war. In the center of the room, May stirred. She saw a gunman aiming at Caleb's exposed flank. She grabbed a bottle of high-proof spirits from the floor. With the last of her strength, she hurled it. It hit the gunman's arm just as he fired. His shot went wild, hitting a kerosene lantern hanging above the heavy velvet curtains. The lantern shattered. The oil sprayed. The curtains caught fire instantly. "Fire!" someone screamed. The flames licked up the wall, hungry and fast. The smoke turned black and choking. Caleb stood up, firing to keep the gunmen back. "Eliza, get out! Go to the back door!" Eliza looked at him. She wanted to run to him, but she looked down at May, who was trying to crawl. She looked at the other women, huddled in terror behind the piano. She couldn't leave them. Eliza grabbed May, hauling her up. "Come on," she yelled to the other girls. "Move!" She herded them like a shepherd in a storm, pushing them toward the kitchen, shielding them with her own body. Caleb saw it. He saw her bravery. He covered them, putting rounds into the ceiling and the floor to keep the attackers' heads down. The heat was intense now. The wallpaper was peeling. The liquor behind the bar exploded. "Go!" Caleb shouted. Eliza shoved the last girl through the back door and stumbled out into the alley, dragging May. She fell onto the frozen mud, coughing, her eyes stinging. A second later, Caleb burst through the door, smoke billowing around him like a cape. He dropped his rifle and fell to his knees beside her. "Eliza!" He grabbed her, pulling her into him. His arms went around her hard, crushing the air from her lungs. Eliza clung to him. She buried her face in his chest, sobbing, her hands gripping his coat. I thought you would be better off," she choked out. "I thought I was poison. Caleb." He held her face in his hands, forcing her to look at him. His face was streaked with soot, his eyes wild and wet. "I crossed the mountains. Eliza, I stared down guns. I walked through hell, because I cannot breathe right in a world where you are not free. Do you understand? You are not poison. You are my life." Eliza looked at him. She saw the truth of it written in the lines of his face. She saw the love that had driven him through the snow. "I'm sorry," she wept. "I am so sorry." "Don't be sorry," Caleb said, kissing her forehead, her hair, her soot-stained cheeks. "Just be here, behind them." The roof of the Silver Star groaned, with a sound like a dying beast. It collapsed inward. A pillar of sparks shot up into the night sky, illuminating the canyon. The brothel burned. The velvet curtains, the stained sheets, the ledgers of debt, it all burned. It was a twisted, violent cleansing. Men poured out of the building, coughing and cursing. Briggs stood in the street, screaming at the flames, watching his empire turn to ash. Caleb stood up, pulling Eliza with him. He kept one arm around her waist, his other hand on his gun. He looked at the fire. Then he looked at Eliza. "It is done," he said. "The cage is gone. Eliza watched the flames. She felt the heat on her face, and for the first time in 3 years, she didn't feel the cold. She leaned into Caleb, the man who had come for her, and she let the fire burn the past away. The morning sun rose over Granite Peak, but it brought no warmth. It only served to illuminate the black scar where the silver star had stood. The air was thick with the smell of wet charcoal, sulfur, and the lingering stench of violence. Smoke still curled from the ruins, twisting into the gray sky like the ghosts of the women who had suffered there. The town teetered on a knife's edge. The destruction of the brothel had shattered the fragile, corrupt order that held the mining camp together. In the muddy streets, men gathered in tight knots, their hands resting near their weapons. The miners who had fought alongside Caleb stood near the doctor's tent, leaning on their pickaxes, but others, men who had been on Briggs's payroll, or those who simply feared change, were muttering darkly. They looked at Caleb with suspicion. To them, he was a drifter, a gunman, an outsider who had ridden in and burned down a local institution. Lynch him, a voice shouted from near the saloon. He brings nothing but trouble. Run him out, another echoed. Caleb stood by the doctor's tent, his hand resting on the stock of his Winchester. He was tired. His shoulder throbbed where the bullet had grazed him, and his bad leg felt like it was filled with lead. But he did not back down. He watched the crowd, gauging the distance, calculating the angles. Beside him, Eliza stood. Her face was smudged with soot, her dress torn, but her head was high. She held May's hand, supporting the other woman who was barely standing. Suddenly, "Doctor!" Aris stepped out of the tent. He looked small and gray, but he held a thick, leather-bound ledger in his hands like a shield. "There will be no lynching today," the doctor shouted, his voice cracking but carrying across the silence. "Unless you want to hang the truth along with the man." Silas, the giant miner, stepped up beside the doctor. He rested a heavy sledgehammer on his shoulder. "Anyone who wants to touch the cowboy goes through me," Silas rumbled. "What truth?" a man in the crowd yelled. "That he is an arsonist? The truth about where your money goes." "Doctor," Aris said. He held up the book. "I have kept records, 10 years of records. I know who paid Sheriff Kincaid to look the other way when a girl was beaten. I know who paid Briggs to dispose of the bodies of the ones who didn't survive the winter." A ripple of unease went through the crowd. Men glanced at each other. "Kincaid and Briggs are not businessmen," the doctor continued. "They are butchers, and I have the proof right here." News rippled through the gathered men like wind through dry grass. Judge Holloway was riding the circuit. He was camped only 10 miles down the valley and would be in Granite Peak by noon. The mood shifted. The mob mentality, hot and irrational, cooled into a grim curiosity. The respectable citizens, the merchants, the shift bosses, the men who had turned a blind eye but claimed to fear God, saw a way out. If a judge was coming, let the law handle it. "We wait for the judge," someone shouted. Caleb let out a breath he had been holding. He looked at Eliza. "It is not over," he said quietly. "No," Eliza replied, looking at the ledger in the doctor's hands. "It is just beginning." They waited in the back room of the doctor's tent. The air was close and smelled of iodine. Eliza sat on a crate, her hands trembling in her lap. Caleb crouched beside her. "You know what this means," he said gently. "If we take this to the judge, you have to speak. The ledger is just numbers. You are the voice." Eliza looked at the dirt floor. She felt a wave of nausea. To speak meant to stand up in front of the world and admit what she had been. It meant detailing the shame, the degradation, the things she had tried so hard to forget. "I don't know if I can," she whispered. "You don't have to," Caleb said immediately. He took her hand. "We can ride. Right now. We can be in the past before the judge gets here. I will not think less of you. I will never think less of you." Eliza looked up at him. She saw the conflict in his eyes. He wanted justice. She could see the fire of it burning in him, but he wanted to protect her more. He was willing to let Briggs and Kincaid walk free if it meant sparing her pain. She looked at May, who was lying on a cot in the corner, her face swollen and purple. She looked at the other women huddled together, terrified and silent. If she ran, they stayed. If she ran, the story ended here, and nothing changed. "I'm tired. Caleb?" she said softly. "I know," he said. "No." Eliza shook her head. I'm tired of being a shadow. I am tired of hiding." She stood up. Her legs were shaky, but she locked her knees. "I spent 3 years wishing someone would hear me," she said, her voice gaining strength. "I screamed in my head every night. Now, there is a man coming who is paid to listen. I am going to make him hear." Caleb stood slowly. He looked at her with a mixture of awe and fierce pride. "Then I will be right beside you," he said. "And if anyone looks at you wrong, they answer to me." Judge Holloway arrived at noon. He was a man carved from old oak, with a face full of deep lines and eyes that had seen too much of the frontier's ugliness. He set up court in the only building large enough to hold the crowd, the mess hall of the largest mining company. The room was packed. Miners, drifters, and shopkeepers squeezed onto the rough benches. The air was thick with the smell of wet wool, tobacco, and anticipation. Briggs and Kincaid sat at a table near the front. They looked confident. Briggs was blustering, talking loudly to anyone who would listen about property rights and vandalism. Kincaid sat with his arms crossed, his badge gleaming, staring at the door with a smirk. Then, the door opened. A silence fell over the room. It started at the back and rolled forward like a wave. Eliza walked in. She had washed the soot from her face, though the shadows under her eyes remained. She wore the plain calico dress she had packed in Oak Creek, wrinkled now but clean. She walked with her head held high, staring straight ahead. Behind her walked Caleb. He had discarded his coat, revealing the holster at his hip and the bandage on his shoulder. He walked with his distinctive limp, his eyes scanning the crowd, daring anyone to speak. They walked to the front and took their seats on the bench reserved for witnesses. The proceedings began. Briggs spoke first, spinning a tale of a debt unpaid and a violent drifter who had kidnapped his lawful employee and destroyed his business. Kincaid backed him up, citing statutes and contracts, using the language of the law to twist the truth into a knot. Judge Holloway listened, his face impassive. He made notes in a small book. Then, he called Eliza. Eliza stood. She walked to the small chair placed before the judge. She felt the weight of 300 pairs of eyes on her back. She felt the heat of the shame trying to rise up her neck. "State your name," the judge said. "Eliza," she said. Her voice was a whisper. "Louder, please," the judge said, not unkindly. Eliza took a breath. She looked at Caleb. He gave her a small nod, his eyes steady and anchoring. "My name is Eliza," she said, her voice clear and ringing. "Tell me about the debt," the judge said. "There was no debt," Eliza said. She gripped the arms of the chair. "I borrowed $20 for medicine for my brother. I worked for 3 years. I served drinks. I cleaned floors. And I did other things. The room was so quiet you could hear the wind outside. Mr. Briggs told me the interest was compounding." Eliza continued. "He told me I would never be free. He sold me to the mines like a mule. And Sheriff Kincaid, he came to Oak Creek and dragged me back at gunpoint. He told me if I didn't come, he would kill the man who tried to help me." "Lies," Briggs shouted, jumping up. "She is a whore. She is lying to save her skin." "Sit down, sir," the judge barked, slamming his hand on the table. Eliza did not flinch. She turned to look at Briggs. "I am a human being," she said, "and you treated me like an animal. You starved us, you beat us, you let men do whatever they wanted because we were only women." May testified next. She had to be helped to the chair. Her testimony was disjointed, broken by sobs, but the physical evidence on her face spoke louder than her words. Other women came forward, whispering stories of sisters who vanished, of beatings in the alley, of Kincaid taking a cut of their earnings every week. The mood in the room shifted. The miners, rough men who lived hard lives, began to look at Briggs with disgust. They had used the brothel. Yes, but to see the machinery of it laid bare, the calculated cruelty, turned their stomachs. Finally, Dr. Harris presented the ledger. Judge Holloway put on a pair of spectacles. He opened the book. He ran a finger down the columns of numbers. He stopped at a page. "Sheriff Kincaid," the judge said, his voice ice cold. "According to this, you received a payment of $50 on the 14th of last month. The notation says silence regarding the girl found in the creek." Kincaid's face went pale. "That is a forgery." He spat. "The doctor is a drunk." The judge turned the page. And here, payments for recovery of property, payments for protection. The judge closed the book. The sound was like a gavel strike. "This is not a business. Mr. Briggs," the judge said, "this is a slavery ring operating under the guise of commerce. And you, Sheriff, are not a lawman. You are a partner in crime. I will not sit here and listen to this," Briggs yelled. He looked at Kincaid. "Do something." Kincaid saw the walls closing in. He saw the angry faces of the miners. He saw the judge reaching for his pen to sign an order. Desperation took over. Kincaid's hand flashed to his holster. "I am the law here," Kincaid screamed, drawing his gun. He never leveled it. Caleb was already moving. He had been watching Kincaid's hand since the moment the ledger was opened. He didn't draw his own gun. He knew a shootout in a crowded room would kill bystanders. Instead, Caleb lunged across the short distance, driving his shoulder into Kincaid's midsection. The two men crashed to the floor. The gun skittered across the planks. Kincaid punched Caleb hard in his wounded shoulder, sending a shock of white pain through him. Caleb grunted but didn't let go. He drove a fist into Kincaid's jaw. Once, twice. Silas and three other miners jumped the rail. They grabbed Kincaid, pinning him to the floor. Another group grabbed Briggs, who was trying to run for the back door. "Order," the judge shouted. "Order in this court." Caleb stood up, breathing hard, wiping blood from his lip. He looked down at Kincaid, who was held fast by the miners. "It is over, Kincaid," Caleb said. The judge stood. He looked at the chaos, then at the prisoners. "Sheriff Kincaid, Mr. Briggs, you are under arrest. You will be transported to Leadville to stand trial for racketeering, kidnapping, and murder. And if I had a gallows outside, I would save the state the cost of the wagon." A cheer went up from the crowd, a roar of grim satisfaction. The judge held up a hand. "One more thing." He picked up a piece of paper from his desk. It was a letter, worn and creased. "I received this letter yesterday from the Texas Rangers regarding a query about a Mr. Caleb Thorne." The room went quiet again. Caleb stiffened. He looked at the judge. "It concerns an incident in the Lincoln County War." The judge said, "The shooting of a young man named Billy Carver." Caleb closed his eyes. "Here it comes," he thought. "The final nail. The letter confirms." The judge read, "That Mr. Thorne was fired upon first. A witness has come forward, a man who fought for the opposing side, stating that the boy panicked and fired, and Mr. Thorne returned fire in self-defense. The warrant for his arrest is hereby quashed." Caleb opened his eyes. He felt the floor sway beneath him. For 5 years, he had carried the weight of a murderer. He had walked through the world believing he was a villain. "Mr. Thorne," the judge said, looking at him over his spectacles, "you are a free man, and it seems this town owes you a debt of gratitude." Caleb looked at Eliza. She was smiling, tears streaming down her face. He let out a long, shuddering breath. The ghost of the boy in Texas, the ghost that had haunted his sleep, finally faded away. The sun was setting by the time the excitement settled. Kincaid and Briggs were in irons, locked in a secure wagon under heavy guard. The town was returning to its business, but the air felt different, lighter, cleaner. Caleb and Eliza walked to the edge of the camp, away from the noise. They stood on a ridge overlooking the valley. The snow on the distant peaks turned pink and gold in the dying light. Caleb leaned against a pine tree. He looked tired, but the tension that had held his shoulders for so long was gone. "So," he said softly, "free, both of us," Eliza said. She stood beside him, wrapping her shawl tighter against the evening chill. "What will you do?" she asked. Caleb looked at the horizon. "I am done drifting. Eliza, I have seen enough of the trail." He turned to face her. There is a valley south of here, near the foothills. The soil is rough, mostly rock and sage, but there is water. A man could build a cabin there. He could run a few head of cattle, plant a garden. Eliza looked at him, her heart beating fast. It wouldn't be an easy life, Caleb said. Winters are hard, the work never ends, but it would be quiet, and it would be ours. He reached out and took her hand. His thumb brushed over her knuckles. I want you there with me, Eliza, but only if you choose it. You can go east. You can go to the city. You are free now. You don't owe anyone anything, not even me. Eliza looked at his hand holding hers. She thought about the city, paved streets, brick buildings, anonymity. It sounded safe, but then she looked at his face. She saw the scar on his cheek, the gray in his beard, the eyes that had looked at her in a blizzard and seen a person worth saving. I don't want the city, she whispered. I want the rough soil. Caleb's hand tightened on hers. Are you sure? I have never been more sure of anything, she said. I want the cabin. Caleb, I want the fire. I want you. They rode south the next morning. They did not ride alone at first. They escorted May and 2 other women to the nearest railhead, giving them money from the sale of Caleb's spare horse to buy tickets to Denver, where a church group had a shelter. Saying goodbye was hard. May hugged Eliza, weeping. You made it, May said. You really made it. We all made it, Eliza said. When the train pulled away, leaving a trail of steam against the blue sky, it was just Caleb and Eliza. They turned their horses toward the foothills. The journey was slow. They stopped often to let the horses rest, to drink from icy streams, to simply look at the land. The conversations grew longer, deeper. They talked about everything they had held back. Caleb told her about his childhood in Kentucky, about the smell of tobacco barns and rain. Eliza told him about her brother, about the dreams he had, about the way he used to carve wooden birds. They talked about the house they would build. I want a door with a lock, Eliza said one evening as they camped in a grove of aspen. You will have a lock, Caleb promised, but you will have the key and a window, she said, facing east, so I can see the sun come up. Facing east, he agreed. They camped that night beneath a sky that looked like spilled diamonds. The air was cold, but the fire was warm. They laid their bedrolls close together. For weeks, there had been a hesitation, a careful dance around the trauma they both carried. But tonight, under the vast, open sky, something shifted. Eliza lay watching the stars. She felt Caleb beside her. She felt the heat of his body. She realized she wasn't afraid anymore. The fear had burned up in the silver star. What was left was a hunger that was clean and bright. She rolled over. She reached out and touched Caleb's face. He opened his eyes. He didn't move. He let her trace the line of his jaw, the roughness of his scar. Caleb, she whispered. He looked at her, his eyes dark and questioning. I'm not broken, she said. No, he said softly. You are not. She moved closer, pressing her body against his. She threaded her fingers through his hair. Make me feel alive, she said. Please. Caleb pulled her to him. He kissed her, and this time, she didn't pull away. This time, she opened to him. The night was tender and unhurried. There was no urgency, no taking. There was only giving. It was a reclaiming of touch, a rewriting of what it meant to be held. Every caress was a promise kept. When they finally slept, wrapped in each other's arms, the wind blew through the aspen trees, but it sounded like a song, not a warning. 6 months later, the cabin stood on a rise overlooking the valley. It was built of lodgepole pine. The logs fitted tight and chinked with mud and moss. Smoke rose lazily from the stone chimney. It was evening. The sun was sinking behind the jagged peaks to the west, painting the sky in violent shades of orange and purple. Caleb was chopping wood by the side of the house. The rhythmic thwack-thwack of the axe echoed across the valley. He paused, wiping sweat from his brow, and looked at the small garden where green shoots of potatoes and beans were pushing through the rocky soil. A horse and buggy came up the track. It was Mrs. Harper. She came to visit once a month, bringing news from Oak Creek and jars of preserves. The town had changed, slowly. Some people still whispered, but others, seeing the way Caleb and Eliza worked the land, seeing the quiet dignity of their life, had begun to soften. The minister had even stopped by, awkwardly offering a blessing on their harvest. Eliza came out of the cabin. She wore a simple dress, her hair braided back, her face brown from the sun and fuller than it had been. She smiled at Caleb as she went to greet Mrs. Harper. Caleb watched her. He felt a swelling in his chest that was almost painful. It was peace. It was a strange, heavy thing, but he was learning to carry it. Later that night, the wind picked up. It rattled against the sturdy walls of the cabin, a reminder that the West was still wild, still dangerous. But inside, the fire cracked warmly in the hearth. Eliza sat on the rug in front of the fire. Caleb sat behind her, his back against his favorite chair. She leaned back into him, resting her head on his shoulder. His arms came around her, holding her secure. She ran her fingers over the scar on his side, feeling the ridge of old skin through his shirt. She remembered the first time she had seen him in the Red Lantern. She remembered the nights of endless hunger, the feeling that she was hollowing out. That hunger was gone. It had been replaced by the smell of wood smoke, the taste of fresh bread, and the sound of Caleb's breathing. She turned in his arms, looking up at him. The firelight danced in his eyes. "What are you thinking?" he asked softly. "I'm thinking about the storm," she said. "The blizzard. That was a long time ago," Caleb said. "I know," she whispered, "but I am glad for it. If I hadn't frozen, I wouldn't have known how warm your hands were." Caleb smiled, the lines around his eyes crinkling. He kissed her, a slow, deep kiss that tasted of the life they had built. "I can't forget your touch," Eliza whispered against his lips. "And you never have to," Caleb answered. He held her tighter as the fire popped and hissed. Outside, the world was vast and cold. But here, in the small circle of light they had carved out of the darkness, they were home. They had survived the worst of men and the worst of nature, and they had chosen, again and again, to stay. And that, Eliza knew as she closed her eyes, was the only victory that mattered. Thank you so much for listening to this story. It has been a journey through the snow, the fire, and the healing of two broken souls in the American West. I hope Caleb and Eliza's story resonated with you. I would love to know where you are listening from today. Please leave a comment below sharing your location and your thoughts on the ending. Did Eliza and Caleb find the peace they deserved? If you enjoyed this tale, please consider subscribing to From Wild West for more stories of romance, survival, and the rugged frontier. Your support means the world. Until next time, keep your fires burning bright.